Letters on Tactics, Collected Letters and Speeches of Vladimir Lenin. Narrated by American Mail 1, version 0.1. Published by Logos Ex Machina. On April 4, 1917, I had occasion to make a report on the subject indicated in the title, first, at a meeting of Bolsheviks in Petrograd. These were delegates to the All-Russia Conference of Soviets of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, who had to leave for their homes and therefore could not allow me to postpone it. After the meeting, the chairman, Comrades, asked me on behalf of the whole assembly to repeat my report immediately at a joint meeting of Bolshevik and Menshevik delegates, who wished to discuss the question of unifying the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Difficult though it was for me immediately to repeat my report, I felt that I had no right to refuse once this was demanded of me by my comrades and ideas as well as by the Mensheviks, who, because of their impending departure, really could not grant me a delay. In making my report, I read the theses which were published in number 26 of Pravda on April 7, 1917. Both the theses and my report gave rise to differences of opinion among the Bolsheviks themselves and the editors of Pravda. After a number of consultations, we unanimously concluded that it would be advisable openly to discuss our differences, and thus provide material for the All-Russia Conference of our party, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, united under the Central Committee, which is to meet in Petrograd on April 20, 1917. Complying with this decision concerning a discussion, I am publishing the following letters in which I do not claim to have made an exhaustive study of the question, but wish merely to outline the principal arguments, which are especially essential for the practical task of the working class movement. First letter, Assessment of the Present Situation. Marxism requires of us a strictly exact and objectively verifiable analysis of the relations of classes and of the concrete features peculiar to each historical situation. We Bolsheviks have always tried to meet this requirement, which is absolutely essential for giving a scientific foundation to policy. Our theory is not a dogma, but a guide to action, Marx and Engels always said, rightly ridiculing the mere memorizing and repetition of formulas that at best are capable only of marking out general tacts, which are necessarily modifiable by the concrete economic and political conditions of each particular period of the historical process. What, then, are the clearly established objective facts which the party of the revolutionary proletariat must now be guided by in defining the tasks and forms of its activity? Both in my first letter from afar, the first stage of the first revolution, published in Pravda numbers 14 and 15, March 21 and 22, 1917, and in my theses, I defined a specific feature of the present situation in Russia as a period of transition from the first stage of the revolution to the second. I therefore considered the basic slogan, the task of the day, at this moment to be, workers, you have performed miracles of proletarian heroism, the heroism of the people, in the civil war against Tsarism. You must perform miracles of organization of the proletariat and of the whole people, to prepare the way for your victory in the second stage of the revolution, Pravda number 15. What, then, is the first stage? It is the passing of state power to the bourgeoisie. Before the February-March Revolution of 1917, state power in Russia was in the hands of one old class, namely, the feudal landed nobility, headed by Nicholas Romanov. After the revolution, the power is in the hands of a different class, a new class, namely, the bourgeoisie. The passing of state power from one class to another is the first, the principal, the basic sign of a revolution, both in the strictly scientific and in the practical political meaning of that term. To this extent, the bourgeois, or the bourgeois democratic, revolution in Russia is completed. But at this point we hear clamor of protest from people who readily call themselves old Bolsheviks. Didn't we always maintain, they say, that the bourgeois democratic revolution is completed only by the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry? Is the agrarian revolution, which is also a bourgeois democratic revolution, completed? Is it not a fact, on the contrary, that it has not even started? My answer is, the Bolshevik slogans and ideas on the whole have been confirmed by history, but concretely things have worked out differently. They are more original, more peculiar, more varied than anyone could have expected. To ignore or overlook this fact would mean taking after those old Bolsheviks, who more than once already have played so regrettable a role in the history of our party by reiterating formulas senselessly learned by rote instead of studying the specific features of the new and living reality. The revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry has already become a reality in the Russian Revolution, for this formula envisages only a relation of classes and not a concrete political institution implementing this relation, this cooperation. The Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. There you have the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry already accomplished in reality. This formula is already antiquated. Events have moved it from tile realm of formulas into the realm of reality, clothed it with flesh and bone, concretized it and thereby modified it. A new and different task now faces us, to effect a split within this dictatorship between the proletarian elements, the anti-defensist, internationalist, communist elements, to stand for a transition to the commune, and the small proprietor or petty bourgeois elements, Chase, Zaratali, Slekov, the socialist revolutionaries and the other revolutionary defenses, who are opposed to moving towards the commune and are in favor of rewarding the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois government. The person who now speaks only of a revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry is behind the times. Consequently, he has in effect gone over to the petty bourgeoisie against the proletarian class struggle. That person should be consigned to the archive of Bolshevik pre-revolutionary antiques. It may be called the archive of old Bolsheviks. The revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry has already been realized, but in a highly original manner, and with a number of extremely important modifications. I shall deal with them separately in one of my next letters. For the present, it is essential to grasp the incontestable truth that a Marxist must take cognizance of real life, of the true facts of reality, and not cling to a theory of yesterday, which, like all theories, at best only outlines the main and the general, only comes near to embracing life in all its complexity. Theory, my friend, is gray, but green is the eternal tree of life. To deal with the question of completion of the bourgeois revolution in the old way is to sacrifice living Marxism to the dead letter. According to the old way of thinking, the rule of the bourgeoisie could and should be followed by the rule of the proletariat and the peasantry, by their dictatorship. In real life, however, things have already turned out differently. There has been an extremely original, novel and unprecedented interlacing of the one with the other. We have side by side, existing together, simultaneously, both the rule of the bourgeoisie, the government of Lov and Duchov, and a revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, which is voluntarily ceding power to the bourgeoisie, voluntarily making itself an appendage of the bourgeoisie. For it must not be forgotten that actually, in Petrograd, the power is in the hands of the workers and soldiers. The new government is not using and cannot use violence against them, because there is no police, no army standing apart from the people, no officialdom standing all-powerful above the people. This is a fact, the kind of fact that is characteristic of a state of the Paris Commune type. This fact does not fit into the old schemes. One must know how to adapt schemes to facts, instead of reiterating the now meaningless words about a dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, in general. To throw more light on this question, let us approach it from another angle. The Marxist must not abandon the ground of careful analysis of class relations. The bourgeoisie is in power, but is not the mass of the peasants also bourgeoisie, only of a different social stratum, of a different kind, of a different character? Whence does it follow that this stratum cannot come to power, thus completing the bourgeois democratic revolution? Why should this be impossible? This is how the old Bolsheviks often argue. My reply is that it is quite possible, but in assessing a given situation, a Marxist must proceed not from what is possible, but from what is real. And the reality reveals the fact that freely elected soldiers and peasants' deputies are freely joining the second, parallel government, and are freely supplementing, developing and completing it. And, just as freely, they are surrendering power to the bourgeoisie, a fact which does not in the least contravene the theory of Marxism, for we have always known and repeatedly pointed out that the bourgeoisie maintains itself in power not only by force but also by virtue of the lack of class consciousness and organization, the routinism and downtrodden state of the masses. In view of this present-day reality, it is simply ridiculous to turn one's back on the fact and talk about possibilities. Possibly the peasantry may seize all the land and all the power. Far from forgetting this possibility, far from confining myself to the present, I definitely and clearly formulate the agrarian program, taking into account the new phenomenon, i.e., the deeper cleavage between the agricultural laborers and the poor peasants on the one hand, and the peasant proprietors on the other. But there is also another possibility. It is possible that the peasants will take the advice of the petty bourgeois party of the socialist revolutionaries, which has yielded to the influence of the bourgeoisie, has adopted a defensive stand, and which advises waiting for the Constituent Assembly, although not even the date of its convocation has yet been fixed. It is possible that the peasants will maintain and prolong their deal with the bourgeoisie, a deal which they have now concluded through the Soviets of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies not only in form, but in fact. Many things are possible. It would be a great mistake to forget the agrarian movement and the agrarian program. But it would be no less a mistake to forget the reality, which reveals the fact that an agreement, or, to use a more exact, less legal, but more class economic term, class collaboration exists between the bourgeoisie and the peasantry. When this fact ceases to be a fact, when the peasantry separates from the bourgeoisie, seizes the land and power despite the bourgeoisie, that will be a new stage in the bourgeois democratic revolution, and that matter will be dealt with separately. A Marxist who, in view of the possibility of such a future stage, were to forget his duties in the present, when the peasantry is in agreement with the bourgeoisie, would turn petty bourgeois. For he would in practice be preaching to the proletariat confidence in the petty bourgeoisie. This peasantry must separate from the bourgeoisie while the bourgeois democratic revolution is still on. Because of the possibility of so pleasing and sweet a future, in which the peasantry would not be the tail of the bourgeoisie, in which the socialist revolutionaries, the chaises, Zardofilis, and Slekov would not be independent of the bourgeois government. Because of the possibility of so pleasing a future, he would be forgetting the unpleasant present, in which the peasantry still forms the tail of the bourgeoisie, and in which the socialist revolutionaries and social democrats have not yet given up their role as an appendage of the bourgeois government, as His Majesty, Lovas opposition. This hypothetical person would resemble a Swedish Leblanc or a sugary Kautsky, but certainly not a revolutionary Marxist. But are we not in danger of falling into subjectivism, of wanting to arrive at the socialist revolution by skipping the bourgeois democratic revolution, which is not yet completed and has not yet exhausted the peasant movement? I might be incurring this danger if I said, no czar, but a workers' government, but I did not say that, I said something else. I said that there can be no government, barring a bourgeois government, in Russia other than that of the Soviets of Workers, Agricultural Laborers, Soldiers, and Peasants' Deputies. I said that power in Russia now can pass from Guchav and Lvov only to these Soviets. And in these Soviets, as it happens, it is the peasants, the soldiers, i.e., petty bourgeoisie, who preponderate, to use a scientific Marxist term, a class characterization, and not a common, man-in-the-street, professional characterization. In my theses, I absolutely insured myself against skipping over the peasant movement, which has not outlived itself, or the petty bourgeois movement in general, against any playing a seizure of power by a workers' government, against any kind of Blinkist adventurism, for I pointedly referred to the experience of the Paris Commune. And this experience, as we know, and as Marx proved at length in 1871 and Engels in 1891, absolutely excludes Blankism, absolutely ensures the direct, immediate and unquestionable rule of the majority and the activity of the masses only to the extent that the majority itself acts consciously. In the theses, I very definitely reduced the question to one of a struggle for influence within the Soviets of Workers, Agricultural Laborers, Peasants, and Soldiers' Deputies. To leave no shadow of doubt on this score, I twice emphasized in the theses the need for patient and persistent explanatory work adapted to the practical needs of the masses. Ignorant persons or renegades from Marxism, like Mr. Plekhanov, may shout about anarchism, Blankism, and so forth. But those who want to think and learn cannot fail to understand that Blankism means the seizure of power by a minority, whereas the Soviets are admittedly the direct and immediate organization of the majority of the people. Or confined to a struggle for influence within these Soviets cannot, simply cannot, stray into the swamp of Blankism. Nor can it stray into the swamp of anarchism, for anarchism denies the need for a state and state power in the period of transition from the rule of the bourgeoisie to the rule of the proletariat, whereas I, with a precision that precludes any possibility of misinterpretation, advocate the need for a state in this period, although, in accordance with Marx and the lessons of the Paris Commune, I advocate not the usual parliamentary bourgeois state, but a state without a standing army, without a police opposed to the people, without an official placed above the people. When Mr. Plekhanov, in his newspaper Edinstvo, shouts with all his might that this is anarchism, he is merely giving further proof of his break with Marxism. Challenged by me in Pravda Num 26, to tell us what Marx and Engels taught on the subject in 1871, 1872, and 1875, Mr. Plekhanov can only preserve silence on the question at issue and shout out abuse after the manner of the enraged bourgeoisie. Mr. Plekhanov, the ex-Marxist, has absolutely failed to understand the Marxist doctrine of the state. Incidentally, the germs of this lack of understanding are also to be found in his German pamphlet on anarchism. Now let us see how Comrade Y. Comment, in Pravda number 27, formulates his disagreements with my thesis and with the views expressed above. This will help us to grasp them more clearly. Quote, as for Comrade Lenin's general scheme, writes Comrade Kamenev, it appears to us unacceptable, inasmuch as it proceeds from the assumption that the bourgeois democratic revolution is completed, and builds on the immediate transformation of this revolution into a socialist revolution. Unquote, there are two big mistakes here. First, the question of completion of the bourgeois democratic revolution is stated wrongly. The question is put in an abstract, simple, so to speak one-color way, which does not correspond to the objective reality. To put the question this way, to ask now whether the bourgeois democratic revolution is completed, and say no more, is to prevent oneself from seeing the exceedingly complex reality, which is at least a colored. This is in theory. In practice, it means surrendering helplessly to petty bourgeois revolutionism. Indeed, reality shows us both the passing of power into the hands of the bourgeoisie, a completed, bourgeois democratic revolution of the usual type, and, side by side with the real government, the existence of a parallel government which represents the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. This second government has itself ceded the power to the bourgeoisie, has chained itself to the bourgeois government. Is this reality covered by Comrade Kamenev's old Bolshevik formula, which says that the bourgeois democratic revolution is not completed? It is not. The formula is obsolete. It is no good at all. It is dead, and it is no use trying to revive it. Second, a practical question. Who knows whether it is still possible at present for a special revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, detached from the bourgeois government, to emerge in Russia? Marxist tactics cannot be based on the unknown. But if this is still possible, then there is one, and only one, way towards it, namely, an immediate, resolute, and irrevocable separation of the proletarian communist elements from the petty bourgeois elements. Why? Because the entire petty bourgeoisie has, not by chance but of necessity, turned towards chauvinism, towards support of the bourgeoisie, towards dependence on it, towards the fear of having to do without it, etc. etc. How can the petty bourgeoisie be pushed into power if even now it can take the power, but does not want to? This can be done only by separating the proletarian, the Communist Party, by waging a proletarian class struggle free from the timidity of those petty bourgeois. Only the consolidation of the pro who are free from the influence of the petty bourgeoisie in deed and not only in word can make the ground so hot under the feet of the petty bourgeoisie that it will be obliged under certain circumstances to take the power. It is even within the bounds of possibility that Khrushchev and Milkov, again under certain circumstances, will be for giving full and sole power to Chazy, Tsaritli, the SRS, and Slikov, since, after all, these are defenses. To separate the proletarian elements of the Soviets, i.e., the proletarian Communist Party, from the petty bourgeois elements right now, immediately and irrevocably, is to give correct expression to the interests of the movement in either of two possible events. In the event that Russia will yet experience a special dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, independent of the bourgeoisie, and in the event that the petty bourgeoisie will not be able to tear itself away from the bourgeoisie and will oscillate eternally, that is, until socialism is established, between us and it. To be guided in one's activities merely by the simple formula, the bourgeois democratic revolution is not completed, is like taking it upon oneself to guarantee that the petty bourgeoisie is definitely capable of being dependent of the bourgeoisie. To do so is to throw oneself at the given moment on the mercy of the petty bourgeoisie. Incidentally, in connection with the formula of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, it is worth mentioning that, in Two Tactics, July 1905, I made a point of emphasizing, 12 years, page 435, this, quote, like everything else in the world, the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry is of the past and the future. Its past is autocracy, serfdom, monarchy, and privilege. Its future is the struggle against private property, the struggle of the wage worker against the employer, the struggle for socialism. Unquote. Comrade Kamen's mistake is that even in 1917 he sees only the past of the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. As a matter of fact, its future has already begun. For the interest and policies of the wage worker and the petty proprietor have actually diverged already, even in such an important question as that of defensism, that of the attitude towards the imperialist war. This brings me to the second mistake in Comrade Kamen's argument quoted above. He criticizes me, saying that my scheme builds on the immediate transformation of this revolution into a socialist revolution. This is incorrect. I not only do not build on the immediate transformation of a revolution into a socialist one, but I actually warn against it. When in thesis number 8, I state, it is not our immediate task to introduce socialism. Is it not clear that no person who builds on the immediate transformation of a revolution into a socialist revolution could be opposed to the immediate task of introducing socialism? Moreover, even a commune state, i.e., a state organ along the lines of the Paris Commune, cannot be introduced in Russia immediately, because to do that it would be necessary for the majority of the deputies in all, or in most, Soviets to clearly recognize all the erroneous and harm of the tactics and policy pursued by the SRS, Chase, Arteli, Slekov, etc. As for me, I declared unmistakably that in this respect I build only on patient explaining. Does one have to be patient to bring about a change which can be effected immediately? Comrade Comment has somewhat overreached himself in his eagerness, and has repeated the bourgeois prejudice about the Paris Commune having wanted to introduce socialism immediately. This is not so. The Commune, unfortunately, was too slow in introducing socialism. The real essence of the Commune is not where the bourgeois usually looks for it, but in the creation of a state of a special type. Such a state has already arisen in Russia. It is the Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies. Comrade Kamenev has not pondered on the fact, the significance of the existing Soviets, their identity, in point of type and socio-political character, with the Commune state, and instead of studying the fact, he began to talk about something I was supposed to be building on for the immediate future. The result is, unfortunately, a repetition of the method used by many bourgeois, from the question as to what are the Soviets, whether they are of a higher type than a parliamentary republic, whether they are more useful for the people, more democratic, more convenient for the struggle, for combating, for instance, the grain shortage, etc. From this real, urgent, vital issue, attention is diverted to the empty, would-be scientific but actually hollow, professorally dead question of building on an immediate transformation. An idle question falsely presented. I build only on this, exclusively on this, that the workers, soldiers, and peasants will deal better than the officials, better than the police, with the difficult practical problems of producing more grain, distributing it better, and keeping the soldiers better supplied, etc., etc. I am deeply convinced that the Soviets will make the independent activity of the masses a reality more quickly and effectively than will a parliamentary republic. I shall compare the two types of states in greater detail in another letter. They will more effectively, more practically, and more correctly decide what steps can be taken towards socialism and how these steps should be taken. Control over a bank, the merging of all banks into one, is not yet socialism, but it is a step towards socialism. Today such steps are being taken in Germany by it and the bourgeoisie against the people. Tomorrow the Soviet will be able to take these steps more effectively for the benefit of the people if the whole state power is in its hands. What compels such steps? Famine, economic disorganization, imminent collapse, the horrors of war, the horrors of the wounds inflicted on mankind by the war. Comrade Kamenev concludes his article with the remark that, in a broad discussion he hopes to carry his point of view, which is the only possible one for revolutionary social democracy if it wishes to and should remain to the very end the party of the revolutionary masses of the proletariat and not turn into a group of communist propagandists. It seems to me that these words betray a completely erroneous estimate of the situation. Comrade Kamenev contraposes to a party of the masses a group of propagandists, but the masses have now succumbed to the craze of revolutionary defensism. Is it not more becoming for internationalists at this moment to show that they can resist mass intoxication rather than to wish to remain with the masses, i.e., to succumb to the general epidemic? Have we not seen how in all the belligerent countries of Europe the chauvinists tried to justify themselves on the grounds that they wished to remain with the masses? Must we not be able to remain for a time in the minority against the mass intoxication? Is it not the work of the propagandists at the present moment that forms the key point for disentangling the proletarian line from the defensist and petty bourgeois mass intoxication? It was this fusion of the masses, proletarian and non-proletarian, regardless of class differences within the masses, that formed one of the conditions for the defensist epidemic. To speak contemptuously of a group of propagandists advocating a proletarian line does not seem to be very becoming. Except from the Collapse of the Second International, published 1915. But perhaps sincere socialists supported the Basel Resolution in the anticipation that war would create a revolutionary situation, the events rebutting them, as revolution has proved impossible. It is by means of sophistry like this that Cano, in a pamphlet Collapse of the Party, and a series of articles, has tried to justify his desertion to the camp of the bourgeoisie. Hope for a revolution have proved illusory, and it is not the business of a Marxist to fight for illusions, Canal argues. This Struthist, however, does not say a word about illusions that were shared by all signatories to the Basel Manifesto. Like a most upright man, he would put the blame on the extreme leftists, such as Pontikuk and Radek. Let us consider the substance of the argument that the authors of the Basel Manifesto sincerely expected the advent of a revolution, but were rebutted by the events. The Basel Manifesto says, 1. That war will create an economic and political crisis. 2. That the workers will regard their participation in war as a crime, and as criminal any, shooting each other down for the profit of the capitalist. For the sake of dynastic honor and of diplomatic secret treaties, and that war evokes indignation and revolt in the workers. 3. That it is the duty of socialists to take advantage of this crisis and of the workers' temper so as to rouse the people and hasten the downfall of capitalism. 4. That all governments, without exception, can start a war only at their own peril. 5. That governments are afraid of a proletarian revolution. 6. That governments should remember the Paris Commune, i.e., civil war, the 1905 revolution in Russia, etc. All these are perfectly clear ideas. They do not guarantee that revolution will take place, but lay stress on a precise characterization of facts and trends. Hiller declares, with regard to these ideas and arguments, that the anticipated revolution has proved illusory, is displaying not a Marxist but a Struthist and police renegade attitude towards revolution. To the Marxist, it is indisputable that a revolution is impossible without a revolutionary situation. Furthermore, it is not every revolutionary situation that leads to revolution. What, generally speaking, are the symptoms of a revolutionary situation? We shall certainly not be mistaken if we indicate the following three major symptoms. 1. When it is impossible for the ruling classes to maintain their rule without any change. When there is a crisis in one form or another among the upper classes, a crisis in the policy of the ruling class, leading to a fissure through which the discontent and indignation of the oppressed classes burst forth. For a revolution to take place, it is usually insufficient for the lower classes not to want to live in the old way. It is also necessary that the upper classes should be enabled to live in the old way, too, when the suffering and want of the oppressed classes have grown more acute than usual. 3. When, as a consequence of the above causes, there is a considerable increase in the activity of the masses, who uncomplainingly allow themselves to be robbed in peacetime, but in turbulent times are drawn both by all the circumstances of the crisis and by the upper classes themselves into independent historical action. Without these objective changes, which are independent of the will, not only of individual groups and parties, but even of individual classes, a revolution, as a general rule, is impossible. The totality of all these objective changes is called a revolutionary situation. Such a situation existed in 1905 in Russia, and in all revolutionary periods in the West. It also existed in Germany in the 60s of the last century, and in Russia in 1859, 61, and 1879 any. All of no revolution occurred in these instances. Why was that? It was because it is not every revolutionary situation that gives rise to a revolution. Revolution arises only out of a situation in which the above-mentioned objective changes are accompanied by a subjective change, namely, the ability of the revolutionary class to take revolutionary mass action strong enough to break, or dislocate, the old government, which never, not even in a period of crisis, falls if it is not toppled over. Such are the Marxist views on revolution, views that have been developed many, many times, have been accepted as indisputable by all Marxists, and for us, Russians, were corroborated in a particularly striking fashion by the experience of 1905. What, then, did the Basel Manifesto assume in this respect in 1912, and what took place in 1914-15? It assumed that a revolutionary situation, which it briefly described as an economic and political crisis, would arise. Has such a situation arisen? Undoubtedly, it has. The social chauvinist Lenz, who defends chauvinism more candidly, publicly and honestly than the hypocrites Kanal, Kautsky, Plekhanov and company do, has gone so far as to say, what we are passing through is a kind of revolution, piece 6 of his pamphlet, German Social Democracy in the War, Berlin, 1915. A political crisis exists, No government is sure of the morrow, not one is secure against the danger of financial collapse, loss of territory, expulsion from its country, in the way the Belgian government was expelled. All governments are sleeping on a volcano, all themselves calling for the masses to display initiative and heroism. The entire political regime of Europe has been shaken, and hardly anybody will deny that we have entered, and are entering ever deeper. I write this on the day of Italy's declaration of war, a period of immense political upheavals. When, 2 months after the declaration of war, Cauchy wrote that never is government so strong, never are parties so weak as at the outbreak of a war. This was a sample of the falsification of historical science which Cauchy has perpetrated to please the opportunists. In the first place, never do governments stand in such need of agreement with all the parties of the ruling classes, or of the peaceful submission of the oppressed classes to that rule, as in the time of war. Secondly, even though, at the beginning of a war, and especially in a country that expects a speedy victory, the government seems all-powerful, nobody in the world has ever linked expectations of a revolutionary situation exclusively with the beginning of a war, and still less has anybody ever identified this seeming with the actual. It was generally known, seen and admitted that a European war would be more severe than any war in the past. This is being borne out in ever greater measure by the experience of the war. The conflagration is spreading. The political foundations of Europe are being shaken more and more. The sufferings of the masses are appalling, the efforts of governments, the bourgeoisie and the opportunist, to hush up these sufferings proving ever more futile. The war profits being obtained by certain groups of capitalists are monstrously high, and contradictions are growing extremely acute. The smoldering indignation of the masses, the vague yearning of societies downtrodden and ignorant strive for a kindly, democratic peace, the beginning of discontent among the lower classes, all these are facts. The longer the war drags on and the more acute it becomes, the more the governments themselves foster, and must foster, the activity of the masses, whom they call upon to make extraordinary effort and self-sacrifice. The experience of the war, like the experience of any crisis in history, of any great calamity and any sudden turn in human life, stuns and breaks some people, but enlightens and tempers others. Taken by and large, and considering the history of the world as a whole, the number and strength of the second kind of people have, with the exception of individual cases of the decline and fall of one state or another, proved greater than those of the former kind. Far from immediately ending all these sufferings and all this enhancement of contradictions, the conclusion of peace will, in many respects, make those sufferings more keenly and immediately felt by the most backward masses of the population. In a word, a revolutionary situation obtains in most of the advanced countries and the great powers of Europe. In this respect, the prediction of the Basel Manifesto has been fully confirmed. To deny this truth, directly or indirectly, or to ignore it, as Canal, Plekhanov, Cauchy and company have done, means telling a big lie, deceiving the working class, and serving the bourgeoisie. In Social Democrat numbers 34, 40, and 41, we cited facts which prove that those who fear revolution, petty bourgeois Christian parsons, the general staffs and millionaires' newspapers, are compelled to admit that symptoms of a revolutionary situation exist in Europe. Will this situation last long? How much more acute will it become? Will it lead to revolution? This is something we do not know, and nobody can know. The answer can be provided only by the experience gained during the development of revolutionary sentiment and the transition to revolutionary action by the advanced the proletariat. There can be no talk in this connection about illusions or their repudiation, since no socialist has ever guaranteed that this war, and not the next one, that today's revolutionary situation, and not tomorrow's, will produce a revolution. What we are discussing is the indisputable and fundamental duty of all socialists, that of revealing to the masses the existence of a revolutionary situation, explaining its scope and depth, arousing the proletariat's revolutionary consciousness and revolutionary determination, helping it to go over to revolutionary action, and forming, for that purpose, organizations suited to the revolutionary situation. No influential or responsible socialist has ever dared to feel doubt that this is the duty of the socialist parties. Without spreading or harboring the least illusions, the Basel Manifesto spoke specifically of this duty of the socialist, to rouse and to stir up the people, and not to lull them with chauvinism, as Plekhanov, Axelrod, and Cauchy have done, to take advantage of the crisis so as to hasten the downfall of capitalism, and to be guided by the examples of the Commune end of October-December 1905. The present party's failure to perform that duty meant their treachery, political death, renunciation of their own role and desertion to the side of the bourgeoisie. On Compromises, published 1917. The term compromise in politics implies the surrender of certain demands, the renunciation of part of one's demands by agreement with another party. The usual idea the man in the street has about the Bolsheviks, an idea encouraged by a press which slanders them, is that the Bolsheviks will never agree to a compromise with anybody. The idea is flattering to us as the party of the revolutionary proletariat, for it proves that even our enemies are compelled to admit our loyalty to the fundamental principles of socialism and revolution. Nevertheless, we must say that this idea is wrong. Engels was right when, in his criticism of the Manifesto of the Blinkist Communists, 1873, he ridiculed their declaration, "No compromises." This, he said, was an empty phrase, for compromises are often unavoidably forced upon a fighting party by circumstances, and it is absurd to refuse once and for all to accept payments on account. The task of a truly revolutionary party is not to declare that it is impossible to renounce all compromises, but to be able, through all compromises, when they are unavoidable, to remain true to its principles, to its class, to its revolutionary purpose, to its task of paving the way for revolution and educating the mass of the people for victory in the revolution. To agree, for instance, to participate in the Third and Fourth Dumas was a compromise, a temporary renunciation of revolutionary demands. But this was a compromise absolutely forced upon us, for the balance of forces made it impossible for us for the time being to conduct a mass revolutionary struggle. And in order to prepare this struggle over a long period, we had to be able to work even from inside such a pigsty. History has proved that this approach to the question by the Bolsheviks as a party was perfectly correct. Now the question is not of a forced, but of a voluntary compromise. Our party, like any other political party, is striving after political domination for itself. Our aim is the dictatorship of the revolutionary proletariat. 6 months of revolution have proved very clearly, forcefully and convincingly that this demand is correct and inevitable in the interest of this particular revolution, for otherwise the people will never obtain a democratic peace, land for the peasants, or complete freedom, a fully democratic republic. This has been shown and proved by the course of events during the 6 months of our revolution, by the struggle of the classes and parties, and by the development of the crises of April 2021, June 9-10 and 1819, July 3-5 and August 27-31. The Russian Revolution is experiencing so abrupt and original a turn that we, as a party, may offer a voluntary compromise, true, not to our direct and main class enemy, the bourgeoisie, but to our nearest adversaries, the ruling, petty bourgeois democratic parties, the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks. We may offer a compromise to these parties only by way of exception, and only by virtue of the particular situation, which will obviously last only a very short time. And I think we should do so. The compromise on our part is a return to the pre-July demand of all power to the Soviets and a government of SRS and Mensheviks responsible to the Soviets. Now, and only now, perhaps during only a few days or a week or two, such a government could be set up and consolidated in a perfectly peaceful way. In all probability, it could secure the peaceful advance of the whole Russian Revolution, and provide exceptionally good chances for great strides in the world movement towards peace and the victory of socialism. In my opinion, the Bolsheviks, who are partisans of world revolution and revolutionary methods, may and should consent to this compromise only for the sake of the revolution's peaceful development, an opportunity that is extremely rare in history and extremely valuable, an opportunity that only occurs once in a while. The compromise would amount to the following: the Bolsheviks, without making any claim to participate in the government, which is impossible for the internationalists unless a dictatorship of the proletariat and the poor peasants has been realized, would refrain from demanding the immediate transfer of power to the proletariat and the poor peasants and from employing revolutionary methods of fighting for this demand. A condition that is self-evident and not new to the SRS and Mensheviks would be complete freedom of propaganda and the convocation of the Constituent Assembly without further delays or even at an early date. The Mensheviks and SRS, being the government bloc, would then agree, assuming that the compromise had been reached, to form a government wholly and exclusively responsible to the Soviets, the latter taking over all power locally as well. This would constitute the new condition. I think the Bolsheviks would advance no other conditions, trusting that the revolution would proceed peacefully and party strife in the Soviets would be peacefully overcome thanks to really complete freedom of propaganda and to the immediate establishment of a new democracy in the composition of the Soviets, new elections, and in their functioning. Perhaps this is already impossible, perhaps. But if there is even one chance in 100, the attempt to read this opportunity is still worthwhile. What would both contracting parties gain by this compromise, i.e., the Bolsheviks on the one hand, and the SR and Menshevik bloc on the other? If neither side gains anything, then the compromise must be recognized as impossible, and nothing more is to be said. No matter how difficult this compromise may be at present, after July and August, to months equivalent to 2 decades in peaceful, somnolent times, I think it stands a small chance of being realized. This chance has been created by the decision of the SRS and Mensheviks not to participate in government together with the cadets. The Bolsheviks would gain the opportunity of quite freely advocating their views and of trying to win influence in the Soviets under a really complete democracy. In words, everybody now concedes the Bolsheviks this freedom. In reality, this freedom is impossible under a bourgeois government or a government in which the bourgeoisie participate, or under any government, in fact, other than the Soviets. Under a Soviet government, such freedom would be possible. We do not say it would be a certainty, but still it would be possible. For the sake of such a possibility at such a difficult time, it would be worth compromising with the present majority in the Soviets. We have nothing to fear from real democracy, for reality is on our side, and even the course of development of trends within the SR and Menshevik parties, which are hostile to us, proves us right. The Mensheviks and SRS would gain in that they would at once obtain every opportunity to carry out their bloc's program with the support of the obviously overwhelming majority of the people, and in that they would secure for themselves the peaceful use of their majority in the Soviets. Of course, there would probably be two voices heard from this bloc, which is heterogeneous both because it is a blockade because petty bourgeois democracy is always less homogeneous than the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. One voice would say, we cannot follow the same road as the Bolsheviks and the revolutionary proletariat. It will demand too much anyway and will entice the peasant poor by demagogy. It will demand peace and a break with the Allies. That is impossible. We are better off and safer with the bourgeoisie. After all, we have not parted ways with them but only had a temporary quarrel, and only over the Kornilov incident. We have quarreled, but we shall make it up. Moreover, the Bolsheviks are not ceding us anything, for their attempts at insurrection are as doomed to defeat as was the Commune of 1871. The other voice would say, the allusion to the Commune is very superficial and even foolish, for, in the first place, the Bolsheviks have learned something since 1871. They would not fail to seize the banks, and would not refuse to advance on Versailles. Under such conditions, even the Commune might have been victorious. Furthermore, the Commune could not immediately offer the people what the Bolsheviks will be able to offer if they come to power, namely land to the peasants, an immediate offer of peace, real control over production, an honest peace with the Ukrainians, Finns, etc. The Bolsheviks, to put it bluntly, hold 10 times more trumps than the Commune did. In the second place, the Commune, after all, means a strenuous civil war, a setback to peaceful cultural development for a long time to come, an opportunity for all sorts of McMahons and Kornilovs to operate and plot with greater ease, and such operations are a menace to our whole bourgeois society. Is it wise to risk a Commune? Now a Commune is inevitable in Russia if we do not take power into our own hands, if things remain in as grave a state as they were between May 6 and August 31. Every revolutionary worker and soldier will inevitably think about the Commune and believe in it. He will inevitably attempt to bring it about, for he will argue, the people are perishing, war, famine and ruin are spreading. Only the Commune can save us. So let us all perish, let us die, but let us set up the Commune. Such thoughts are inevitable with the workers, and it will not be as easy to crush the Commune now as it was in 1871. The Russian Commune will have allies throughout the world, allies 100 times stronger than those the Commune had in 1871. Is it wise for us to risk a Commune? I cannot agree, either, that the Bolsheviks virtually cede us nothing by their compromise, for, in all civilized countries, civilized ministers value highly every agreement with the proletariat in wartime, however small. They value it very, very highly. And these are men of action, real ministers. The Bolsheviks are rapidly becoming stronger, in spite of repression, and the weakness of their press. Is it wise for us to risk a Commune? We have a safe majority. The peasant poor will not wake up for some time to come. We are safe for our lifetime. I do not believe that in a peasant country the majority will follow the extremists. And against an obvious majority, no insurrection is possible in a really democratic republic. This is what the second voice would say. There may also be a third voice coming from among the supporters of Mordov or Spiridonov, which would say, I am indignant, comrades, that both of you, speaking about the Commune and its likelihood, unhesitatingly side with its opponents. In one form or another, both of you side with those who suppress the Commune. I will not undertake to campaign for the Commune, and I cannot promise beforehand to fight in its ranks as every Bolshevik will do. But I must say that if the Commune does start in spite of my efforts, I shall rather help its defenders than its opponents. The medley of voices in the bloc is great and inevitable, for a host of shades is represented among the petty bourgeois Democrats. The above lines were written on Friday, September 1, but due to unforeseen circumstances, under currency, as history will tell, not all Bolsheviks were free to choose their domicile. They did not reach the editorial office that day. After reading Saturday's and today's papers, I say to myself, perhaps it is already too late to offer a compromise. Perhaps the few days in which a peaceful development was still possible have passed too. Yes, to all appearances, they have already passed. In one way or another, currency will abandon both the SR party and the SRS themselves, and will consolidate his position with the aid of the bourgeoisie without the SRS, and thanks to their inaction. Yes, to all appearances, the days when by chance the path of peaceful development became possible have already passed. All that remains is to send these notes to the editor with the request to have them entitled Belated Thoughts. Perhaps even belated thoughts are sometimes not without interest. On Compromises, published 1920. In a talk with me, Comrade Lansbury laid particular stress on the following argument of the British opportunist leaders in the labor movement. The Bolsheviks are compromising with the capitalists, agreeing, in the peace treaty with Estonia, for instance, to timber concessions. If that is the case, compromises with capitalists concluded by the moderate leaders of the British labor movement are equally legitimate. Comrade Lansbury considers this argument, very widespread in Britain, of importance to the workers and urgently requiring examination. I shall try to meet this desire. May an advocate of proletarian revolution conclude compromises with capitalists or with the capitalist class? This, apparently, is the question underlying the above argument, but to present it in this general way shows either the extreme political inexperience and low level of political consciousness of the questioner, or his chicanery in using a sophism to veil his justification of brigandage, plunder, and every other sort of capitalist violence. Indeed, it would obviously be silly to give a negative reply to this general question. Of course, an advocate of proletarian revolution may conclude compromises or agreements with capitalists. It all depends on what kind of agreement is concluded and under what circumstances. Here and here alone can and must one look for the difference between an agreement that is legitimate from the angle of the proletarian revolution and one that is treasonable, treacherous from the same angle. To make this clear, I shall first recall the argument of the founders of Marxism and then add some very simple and obvious examples. It is not for nothing that Marx and Engels are considered the founders of scientific socialism. They were ruthless enemies of all phrase-mongering. They taught that problems of socialism, including problems of socialist tactics, must be presented scientifically. In the 70s of last century, when Engels analyzed the revolutionary manifesto of French Blanquists, commune fugitives, he told them in plain terms that their boastful declaration of no compromise was an empty phrase. The idea of compromises must not be renounced. The point is, through all the compromises which are sometimes necessarily imposed by force of circumstance upon even the most revolutionary party of even the most revolutionary class, to be able to preserve, strengthen, steel, and develop the revolutionary tactics and organization, the revolutionary consciousness, determination, and preparedness of the working class and its organized vanguard, the Communist Party. But since in Britain, due to a number of historical causes, Marxism has ever since Chartism, which in many respects was something preparatory to Marxism, the last word but one, before Marxism, been pushed into the background by the opportunist, semi-bourgeois leaders of the trade unions and cooperatives, I shall try to explain the truth of the view expounded by means of typical examples drawn from among the universally known facts of ordinary, political, and economic life. I shall begin with an illustration I gave once before in one of my speeches. Let us suppose the car you are traveling in is attacked by armed bandits. Let us suppose that when a pistol is put to your temple you surrender your car, money, and revolver to the bandits, who proceed to use this car, etc., to commit other robberies. Here is undoubtedly a case of compromising with agreement with them. The agreement, though unsigned and tacitly concluded, is nevertheless quite a definite and precise one. I give you, Mr. Robber, my car, weapon, and money. You rid me of your pleasant company. The question arises, do we call the man who concluded such an agreement with an accomplice in banditry, an accomplice in a robber's assault upon third persons despoiled by the bandits with the aid of the car, money and weapon received by them from the person who concluded this agreement? No, you do not. The matter is absolutely plain and simple, down to the smallest detail. And it is likewise clear that under other circumstances the tacit surrender to the high of the car, money and weapon would be considered by every person of common sense to be complicity in banditry. The conclusion is clear. It is just as silly to renounce the idea of literally all agreements or compromises with robbers as it is to acquit a person of complicity in banditry on the basis of the abstract proposition that, generally speaking, agreements with robbers are sometimes permissible and necessary. Let us now take a political illustration. Remaining manuscript missing. Speech on Parliamentarianism at the Second Congress of the Communist International, August 2, 1920. Comrade Bordiga seems to have wanted to defend the Italian Marxist point of view here, yet he has failed to reply to any of the arguments advanced by other Marxists in favor of parliamentary action. Comrade Bordiga has admitted that historical experience is not created artificially. He has just told us that the struggle must be carried into another sphere. Is he not aware that every revolutionary crisis has been attended by a parliamentary crisis? True. He has said that the struggle must be carried into another sphere, into the Soviets. Bordiga, however, has himself admitted that Soviets cannot be created artificially. The example of Russia shows that Soviets can be organized either during a revolution or on the eve of a revolution. Even in the currency period, the Soviets, which were Menshevik Soviets, were organized in such a way that they could not possibly constitute a proletarian government. Parliament is a product of historical development, and we cannot eliminate it until we are strong enough to disperse the bourgeois parliament. It is only as a member of the bourgeois parliament that one can, in the given historical conditions, wage a struggle against bourgeois society and parliamentarianism. The same weapon as the bourgeoisie employs in the struggle must also be used by the proletariat, of course, with entirely different aims. You cannot assert that that is not the case, and if you want to challenge it, you will have thereby to erase the experience of all revolutionary developments in the world. You have said that the trade unions are also opportunist, that they, too, constitute a danger. On the other hand, however, you have said that an exception must be made in the case of trade unions, because they are workers' organizations. But that is true only up to a certain point. There are very backward elements in the trade unions too, a section of the proletarian petty bourgeoisie, the backward workers, and the small peasants. All these elements really think that their interests are represented in Parliament. This idea must be combated by work within Parliament and by citing the facts, so as to show the masses the truth. Theory will have no effect on the backward masses. They need practical experience. This was to be seen in the case of Russia too. We were obliged to convene the Constituent Assembly even after the victory of the proletariat, so as to prove to the backward pro that they had nothing to gain from that assembly. To bring home the difference between the two, we had to concretely contrapose the Soviets and the Constituent Assembly and to show the Soviets as the only solution. Comrade Saushi, a revolutionary syndicalist, advocated the same theory, but he had no logic on his side. He said that he was not a Marxist, so everything can be readily understood. But you, Comrade Bordiga, assert that you are a Marxist, so we must expect more logic from you. You must know how Parliament can be smashed. If you can do it by an armed uprising in all countries, well and good. You are aware that we in Russia proved our determination to destroy the bourgeois Parliament, not only in theory, but in practice as well. You, however, have lost sight of the fact that this is impossible without fairly long preparations, and that in most countries it is as yet impossible to destroy Parliament at one stroke. We are obliged to carry on a struggle within Parliament for the destruction of Parliament. For the conditions determining the political line of all classes in modern society, you substitute your revolutionary determination. That is why you forget that to destroy the bourgeois Parliament in Russia we were first obliged to convene the Constituent Assembly, even after our victory. You say, it is a fact that the Russian Revolution is a case that is not in accord with conditions in Western Europe, but you have not produced a single weighty argument to prove that to us. We went through a period of bourgeois democracy. We went through it rapidly at a time when we had to agitate for elections to the Constituent Assembly. Later, when the working class was able to seize power, the peasants still believed in the necessity of a bourgeois parliament. Taking account of these backward elements, we had to proclaim the elections and show the masses, by example and by facts, that the Constituent Assembly, which was elected at a time of dire and universal need, did not express the aspirations and demands of the exploited classes. In this way, the conflict between Soviet and bourgeois government became quite clear. Not only to us, the vanguard of the working class, but also to the vast majority of the peasantry, of the petty office employees, the petty bourgeoisie, etc. In all capitalist countries there are backward elements in the working class who are convinced that Parliament is the true representative of the people and do not see the unscrupulous methods employed there. You say that Parliament is an instrument with the aid of which the bourgeoisie deceive the masses. But this argument should be turned against you, and it does turn against your theses. How will you reveal the true character of Parliament to the really backward masses, who are deceived by the bourgeoisie? How will you expose the various parliamentary maneuvers, or the positions of the various parties, if you are not in Parliament, if you remain outside Parliament? If you are Marxist, you must admit that, in capitalist society, there is a close link between the relations of classes and the relations of parties. How, I repeat, will you show all this if you are not members of Parliament, and if you renounce parliamentary action? The history of the Russian Revolution has clearly shown that the masses of the working class, the peasantry, and petty office employees could not have been convinced by any arguments, unless their own experience had convinced them. It has been claimed here that it is a waste of time to participate in the parliamentary struggle. Can one conceive of any other institution in which all classes are as interested as they are in Parliament? This cannot be created artificially. If all classes are drawn into the parliamentary struggle, it is because the class interests and contacts are reflected in Parliament. If it were possible everywhere and immediately to bring about, let us say, a decisive general strike so as to overthrow capitalism at a single stroke, the revolution would have already taken place in a number of countries. But we must reckon with the facts, and Parliament is the scene of the class struggle. Germany provides the best example that a communist group in Parliament is possible. That is why you should have frankly said to the masses, we are too weak to create a party with a strong organization. That would be the truth that ought to be told. But if you confess your weakness to the masses, they would become your opponents, not your supporters. They would become supporters of parliamentarianism. If you say, fellow workers, we are so weak that we cannot form a party disciplined enough to compel its members of Parliament to submit to it, the workers would abandon you, for they would ask themselves, how can we set up a dictatorship of the proletariat with such weaklings? You are very naive if you think that the intelligentsia, the middle class, and the petty bourgeoisie will turn communist the day the proletariat is victorious. If you do not harbor this illusion, you should begin right away to prepare the proletariat to pursue its own line. You will find no exceptions to this rule in any branch of state affairs. On the day following the revolution, you will everywhere find advocates of opportunism who call themselves communists, i.e., petty bourgeois who refuse to recognize the discipline of the Communist Party or of the proletarian state. Unless you prepare the workers for the creation of a really disciplined party, which will compel its members to submit to its discipline, you will never prepare for the dictatorship of the proletariat. I think that this accounts for your unwillingness to admit that the repudiation of parliamentary action by a great many of the new communist parties stems from their weakness. I am convinced that the vast majority of the really revolutionary workers will follow us and speak up against your anti-parliamentary thesis. Letter to the Austrian Communists. The Austrian Communist Party has decided to boycott the elections to the bourgeois democratic parliament. The Second Congress of the Communist International, which ended recently, recognized as the correct tactics communist participation in elections to and the activities in bourgeois parliaments. Judging by reports of the Austrian Communist Party's delegates, I have no doubt that it will set a decision by the Communist International above that of one of the parties. Neither can it be doubted that the Austrian Social Democrats, those traitors to socialism who have gone over to the bourgeoisie, will gloat over the Communist International decision, which is at variance with the Austrian Communist Party's boycott decision. However, politically conscious workers will, of course, pay no heed to the malicious glee of people like the Austrian Social Democrats, those confederates of the Schiedemans and Noses, Thomases and Gomperses. The renter servility to the bourgeoisie has revealed itself sufficiently, and in all countries the workers' indignation at the heroes of the Yellow Second International is ever mounting and spreading. The Austrian Social Democrats are behaving in the bourgeois parliament, as in all spheres of their work, including their own press, in the manner of petty bourgeois democrats who are capable only of spineless vacillation, while in fact they are totally dependent on the capitalist class. We communists enter bourgeois parliaments in order to unmask from their rostrums the deception practiced by these thoroughly corrupt capitalist institutions, which dupe the workers and all working people. One of the Austrian communists' arguments against participation in the bourgeois parliaments deserves somewhat more careful consideration. Here it is, quote, Parliament is of importance to communists only as a platform for agitation. We in Austria have the Council of Workers' Deputies as a platform for agitation. We therefore refuse to take part in elections to the bourgeois parliament. In Germany, there is no Council of Workers' Deputies which can be taken in earnest. That is why the German communists pursue different tactics. Unquote. I consider this argument erroneous. As long as we are unable to disband the bourgeois parliament, we must work against it both from without and within. as long as a more or less appreciable number of working people, not only pro, but also semi-pro and small peasants, still have confidence in the bourgeois democratic instruments employed by the bourgeoisie for duping the workers. We must expose that deception from the very platform which the backward sections of the workers, particularly of the non-proletarian working people, consider most important and authoritative. As long as we communists are unable to take over state power and hold elections, with working people alone voting for their Soviets against the bourgeoisie, as long as the bourgeoisie exercise state power and call upon the different classes of the population to take part in the elections, we are in duty bound to take part in the elections with the purpose of conducting agitation among all working people, not only among pro. As long as the bourgeois parliament remains a means of duping the workers, and phrases about democracy are used to cover up financial swindling and every kind of bribery, the particularly subtle brand of bribery the bourgeoisie practice with regard to writers, NPS, lawyers, and others is nowhere to be seen on so wide a scale as in the bourgeois parliament. We communists are in duty bound to be in this very institution, which is supposed to express the people's will but actually covers up the deception of the people by the wealthy, to untiringly expose this deception, and expose each and every case of the renters and companies' desertion to the capitalists against the workers. It is in Parliament that the relations between bourgeois parties and groups manifest themselves most frequently and reflect the relations between all the classes of bourgeois society. That is why it is in the bourgeois parliament, firm within it, that we communists must tell the people the truth about the relation between classes and parties, and the attitude of the landowners to the farm laborers, of the rich peasants to the poor peasants, of big capital to employees and petty proprietors, etc. The proletariat must know all this, so as to learn to see through all the vile and refined machinations of the capitalist, and to learn to influence the petty bourgeois masses, the non-proletarian masses of the working people. Without this schooling, the proletariat cannot cope successfully with the task of the dictatorship of the proletariat, for even then the bourgeoisie, operating from its new position, that of a deposed class, will carry on, in different forms and in different fields, its policy of duping the peasants, of bribing and intimidating employees, of covering up its self-seeking and unsavory aspirations with phrases about democracy. No, the Austrian communists will not be frightened by the malicious glee of the renters and similar lackeys of the bourgeoisie. The Austrian communists will not be afraid to declare their open and forthright recognition of international proletarian discipline. We are proud that we settle the great problems of the workers' struggle for their emancipation by submitting to the international discipline of the revolutionary proletariat with due account of the experience of the workers in different countries, reckoning with their knowledge and their will, and thus giving effect in deed and not in word, as the Renders, Fritz Adler's and Otto Bauer's do, to the unity of the workers' class struggle for communism throughout the world. To the Comrades Communists of Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, Dagestan, and the Mountaineer Republic, published 1921. I send my warmest greetings to the Soviet republics of the Caucasus, and should like to express the hope that their close alliance will serve as a model of national peace, unprecedented under the bourgeoisie and impossible under the capitalist system, but important as national peace among the workers and peasants of the Caucasian nationalities is. The maintenance and development of the Soviet power, as the transition to socialism, are even more important. The task is difficult, but fully feasible. The most important thing for its successful fulfillment is that the communists of the Transcaucasus should be fully alive to the singularity of their position, and of the position of their republics, as distinct from the position and conditions of the USSR, that they should appreciate the need to refrain from copying our tactics, but thoughtfully vary them in adaptation to the different concrete conditions. The Soviet Republic or Russia had no outside political or military assistance. On the contrary, for years and years it fought the Entente military invasions and blockade. The Soviet republics of the Caucasus have had political and some military assistance from the RSFSR. This alone has made a vast difference. Second, there is now no cause to fear any Entente invasion or military assistance to the Georgian, Azerbaijan, Armenian, Dagestan, and Mountaineer White Guards. The Entente burnt their fingers in Russia, and that will probably compel them to be more cautious for some time. Third, the Caucasian republics have an even more pronounced peasant character than Russia. Fourth, Russia has been, and to a considerable extent still is, economically isolated from the advanced capitalist countries. The Caucasus is in a position to start trading and living together with the capitalist West sooner and with greater ease. These are not all the differences, but they are sufficient to demonstrate the need for different tactics. You will need to practice more moderation and caution, and show more readiness to make concessions to the petty bourgeoisie, the intelligentsia, and particularly the peasantry. You must make the swiftest, most intense, and all possible economic use of the capitalist West through a policy of concessions and trade. Oil, manganese, coal, tarchely mines, and copper are some of your immense mineral resources. You have every possibility to develop an extensive policy of concessions and trade with foreign countries. This must be done on a wide scale, with firmness, skill, and circumspection, and it must be utilized to the utmost for improving the condition of the workers and peasants, and for enlisting the intelligentsia in the work of economic construction. Through trade with Italy, America, and other countries, you must exert every effort to develop the productive forces of your rich land, your water resources and irrigation, which is especially important as a means of advancing agriculture and livestock farming. What the republics of the Caucasus can and must do, as distinct from the USSR, is to effect a slower, more cautious, and more systematic transition to socialism. That is what you must understand, and what you must be able to carry out, as distinct from our own tactics. We fought to make the first breach in the wall of world capitalism. The breach has been made. We have maintained our positions in a fierce and superhuman war against the whites, the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks, who are supported by the Entente countries, their blockaded military assistance. You, comrades communists of the Caucasus, have no need to force a breach. You must take advantage of the favorable international situation in 1921, and learn to build the new with greater caution and more method. In 1921, Europe and the world are not what they were in 1917 and 1918. Do not copy our tactics, but analyze the reasons for their peculiar features, the conditions that gave rise to them, and their results. Go beyond the letter and apply the spirit, the essence, and the lessons of the 1917-21 experience. You must make trade with the capitalist countries your economic foundation right away. The cost should be no object even if it means letting them have tens of millions worth of valuable minerals. You must make immediate efforts to improve the condition of the peasants and start on extensive electrification and irrigation projects. What you need most is irrigation. For more than anything else, it will revive the area and regenerate it, bury the past, and make the transition to socialism more certain. I hope you will pardon my slipshod style. One have had to write the letter at very short notice, so as to send it along with Comrade Mizikov. Once again, I send my best greetings and wishes to the workers and peasants of the Soviet republics of the Caucasus. Speech in defense of the tactics of the Communist International at the Third Congress of the Communist International. June-July 1, 1921. Comrades, I deeply regret that I must confine myself to self-defense. I say deeply regret, because after acquainting myself with Comrade Terracini's speech and the amendments introduced by 3 delegations, I should very much like to take the offensive. For, properly speaking, offensive operations are essential against the views defended by Terracini in these 3 delegations. If the Congress is not going to wage a vigorous offensive against such errors, against such leftist stupidities, the whole movement is doomed. That is my deep conviction. But we are organized and disciplined Marxists. We cannot be satisfied with speeches against individual comrades. We Russians are already sick and tired of these leftist phrases. We are men of organization. In drawing up our plans, we must proceed in an organized way and try to find the correct line. It is, of course, no secret that our theses are compromise, and why not? Among communists, who have already convened the Third Congress and have worked out definite fundamental principles, compromises under certain conditions are necessary. Our theses, put forward by the Russian delegation, were studied and prepared in the most careful way and were the result of long arguments and meetings with various delegations. They aim at establishing the basic line of the Communist International and are especially necessary now after we have not only formally condemned the real centrists but have expelled them from the party. Such are the facts. I have to stand up for these theses. Now, when Terracini comes forward and says that we must continue the fight against the centrists, and goes on to tell how it is intended to wage the fight, I say that if these amendments denote a definite trend, a relentless fight against this trend is essential, for otherwise there is no communism and no communist international. I am surprised that the German Communist Workery has not put its signature to these amendments. Indeed, just listen to what Terracini is defending and what his amendments say. They begin in this way. On page 1, column 1, line 19, the word majority should be deleted. Majority. That is extremely dangerous. Then further, instead of the words basic propositions, insert aims. Basic propositions and aims are two different things. Even the anarchists will agree with us about aims, because they just stand for the abolition of exploitation and class distinctions. I have met and talked with few anarchists in my life, but all the same I have seen enough of them. I sometimes succeeded in reaching agreement with them about aims, but never as regards principles. Principles are not an aim, a program, a tactic, or a theory. Tactics and theory are not principles. How do we differ from the anarchist on principles? The principles of communism consist in the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat and in the use of state coercion in the transition period. Such are the principles of communism, but they are not its aim. And the comrades who have tabled this proposal have made a mistake. Secondly, it is stated there, the word majority should be deleted. The whole passage, quote, "The Third Congress of the Communist International is setting out to review questions of tactics under conditions when in a whole number of countries the objective situation has become aggravated in a revolutionary sense, and when a whole number of communist mass parties have been organized, which, incidentally, in their actual revolutionary struggle have nowhere taken into their hands the virtual leadership of the majority of the working class." Unquote. And so, they want the word majority deleted. If we cannot agree on such simple things, then I do not understand how we can work together and lead the proletariat to victory. Then it is not at all surprising that we cannot reach agreement on the question of principles either. Show me a party which has already won the majority of the working class. Tarachny did not even think of any example. Indeed, there is no such example, and so the word aims is to be put instead of principles, and the word majority is to be deleted. No, thank you. We shall not do it. Even the German party, one of the best, does not have the majority of the working class behind it. That is a fact. We, who face a most severe struggle, are not afraid to utter this truth, but here you have 3 delegations who wish to begin with an untruth, for if the Congress deletes the word majority, it will show that it wants an untruth. That is quite clear. Then comes the following amendment, on page 4, column 1, line 10, the words open letter, etc. should be deleted. I have already heard one speech today in which I found the same idea. But there it was quite natural. It was the speech of Comrade Hempel, a member of the German Communist Workers' Party, he said. The open letter was an act of opportunism. To my deep regret and shame, I have already heard such views privately. But when, at the Congress, after such prolonged debate, the open letter is declared opportunist, that is a shame and a disgrace. And now Comrade Tarachny comes forward on behalf of the 3 delegations and wants to delete the words open letter. What is the good then of the fight against the German Communist Workers' Party? The open letter is a model political step. This is stated in our theses, and we must certainly stand by it. It is a model because it is the first act of a practical method of winning over the majority of the working class. In Europe, where almost all the pro are organized, we must win the majority of the working class, and anyone who fails to understand this is lost to the communist movement. He will never learn anything if he has failed to learn that much during the 3 years of the Great Revolution. Tarachny says that we were victorious in Russia, although the party was very small. He is dissatisfied with what is said in the thesis about Czechoslovakia. Here there are 27 amendments, and if I had a mind to criticism them I should, like some orators, have to speak for not less than 3 hours. We have heard here that in Czechoslovakia the Communist Party has 300,000, 400,000 members, and that it is essential to win over the majority, to create an invincible force and continue enlisting fresh masses of workers. Tarachny is already prepared to attack, he says. If there are already 400,000 workers in the party, why should we want more? Delete, he is afraid of the word masses and wants to eradicate it. Comrade Tarachny has understood very little of the Russian Revolution. In Russia, we were a small party, but we had with us in addition the majority of the Soviets of workers and peasants' deputies throughout the country. Cries, quite true. Do we have anything of the sort? We had with us almost half the army, which then numbered at least 10 million men. Do you really have the majority of the army behind you? Show me such a country. If these views of Comrade Tarachny are shared by 3 other delegations, then something is wrong in the International. Then we must say, stop. There must be a decisive fight. Otherwise the Communist International is lost. Animation. On the basis of my experience, I must say, although I'm taking up a defensive position, that the aim and the principle of my speech consist in defense of the resolution and theses proposed by our delegation. It would, of course, be pedantic to say that not a letter in them must be altered. I have had to read many resolutions, and I am well aware that very good amendments could be introduced in every line of them. But that would be pedantry. If, nevertheless, I declare now that in a political sense not a single letter can be altered, it is because the amendments, as I see them, are of a quite definite political nature and because they led us along a path that is harmful and dangerous to the Communist International. Therefore, and all of us in the Russian delegation must insist that not a single letter in the thesis altered. We have not only condemned our right-wing elements, we have expelled them. We know what they say. Terracini has stated the issue quite clearly. He has defended the theory of an offensive, pointing out dynamic tendencies and the transition from passivity to activity. We in Russia have already had adequate political experience in the struggle against the centrists. As long as 15 years ago, we were waging a struggle against the opportunists and centrists, and also against the Mensheviks, and we were victorious not only over the Mensheviks, but also over the semi-anarchists. If we had not done this, we would not have been able to retain power in our hands for 3.5 years, or even for 3.5 weeks, and we would not have been able to convene communist congresses here. Dynamic tendencies, transition from passivity to activity, these are all phrases the left socialist revolutionaries had used against us. Now they are in prison, defending the aims of communism, and thinking of the transition from passivity to activity. The line of reasoning followed in the proposed amendments is an impossible one, because they contain no Marxism, no political experience, and no reasoning. Have we in our thesis elaborated a general theory of the revolutionary offensive? Has Radek or any one of us committed such a stupidity? We have spoken of the theory of an offensive in relation to a quite definite country and at a quite definite period. From our struggle against the Mensheviks we can quote instances showing that even before the first revolution there were some who doubted whether the Revolutionary Party ought to conduct an offensive. If such doubts assailed any social democrat, as we all called ourselves at that time, we took up the struggle against him and said that he was an opportunist, that he did not understand anything of Marxism and the die of the Revolutionary Party. Is it really possible for a party to dispute whether a revolutionary offensive is permissible in general? To find such examples in this country, one would have to go back some 15 years. If there are centrists or disguised centrists who dispute the theory of the offensive, they should be immediately expelled. That question cannot give rise to disputes. But the fact that even now, after 3 years of the Communist International, we are arguing about dynamic tendencies, about the transition from passivity to activity, that is a shame and a disgrace. We do not have any dispute about this with Comrade Radek, who drafted these theses jointly with us. Perhaps it was not quite correct to begin talking in Germany about the theory of the revolutionary offensive when an actual offensive had not been prepared. Nevertheless, the March action was a great step forward in spite of the mistakes of its leaders. But this does not matter. Hundreds of thousands of workers fought heroically. However courageously the German Communist Worker Party fought against the bourgeoisie, we must repeat what Comrade Radek said in a Russian article about holes. If anyone, even an anarchist, fights heroically against the bourgeoisie, that is, of course, a great thing. But it is a real step forward if hundreds of thousands fight against the vile provocation of the social traders and against the bourgeoisie. It is very important to be critical of one's mistakes. We begin with that. If anyone, after a struggle in which hundreds of thousands have taken part, comes out against this struggle and behaves like Levi, then he should be expelled. And that is what was done. But we must draw a lesson from this. Had we really prepared for an offensive? Indeed, only newspaper articles talked of an offensive. This theory as applied to the March action in Germany in 1921 was incorrect. We have to admit that, but, in general, the theory of the revolutionary offensive is not at all false. We were victorious in Russia, and with such ease, because we prepared for a revolution during the imperialist war. That was the first condition. 10 million workers and peasants in Russia were armed, and our slogan was, an immediate peace at all costs. We were victorious because the vast mass of the peasants were revolutionarily disposed against the big landowners. The socialist revolutionaries, the adherents of the Second and the 2.5 Internationals, were a big peasant party in November 1917. They demanded revolutionary methods but, like true heroes of the Second and the 2.5 Internationals, lacked the courage to act in a revolutionary way. In August and September 1917 we said, theoretically we are fighting the socialist revolutionaries as we did before, but practically we are ready to accept their program because only we are able to put it into effect. We did just what we said. The peasantry, well disposed towards us in November 1917, after a victory, who sent a majority of socialist revolutionaries into the Constituent Assembly, were won over by us, if not in the course of a few days, as I mistakenly expected and predicted, at any rate in the course of a few weeks. The difference was not great. Can you point out any country in Europe where you could win over the majority of the peasantry in the course of a few weeks? Italy, perhaps. If it is said that we were victorious in Russia in spite of not having a big party, that only proves that those who say it have not understood the Russian Revolution and that they have absolutely no understanding of how to prepare for a revolution. Our first step was to create a real communist party so as to know whom we were talking to and whom we could fully trust. The slogan of the first and second Congresses was "Down with the centrists." We cannot hope to master even the ABC of communism, unless all along the line and throughout the world we make short shrift of the centrists and semi-centrist, whom in Russia we call Mensheviks. Our first task is to create a genuinely revolutionary party and to break with the Mensheviks. But that is only a preparatory school. We are already convening the Third Congress, and Comrade Terracini keeps saying that the task of the preparatory school consists in hunting out, pursuing and exposing centrist and semi-centrist. No. Thank you. We have already done this long enough. At the Second Congress we said that the centrists are our enemies, but we must go forward really. The second stage, after organizing into a party, consists in learning to prepare for revolution. In many countries, we have not even learned how to assume the leadership. We were victorious in Russia not only because the undisputed majority of the working class was on our side. During the elections in 1917, the overwhelming majority of the workers were with us against the Mensheviks, but also because half the army, immediately after our seizure of power, and 9/10 of the peasants, in the course of some weeks, came over to our side. We were victorious because we adopted the agrarian program of the socialist revolutionaries instead of our own, and put it into effect. Our victory lay in the fact that we carried out the socialist revolutionary program. That is why this victory was so easy. Is it possible that you in the West can have such illusions? It is ridiculous. Just compare the concrete economic conditions, Comrade Terracini and all of you who have signed the proposed amendments. In spite of the fact that the majority so rapidly came to be on our side, the difficulties confronting us after our victory were very great. Nevertheless, we won through because we kept in mind not only our aims but also our principles, and did not tolerate in our party those who kept silent about principles but talked of aims, dynamic tendencies, and the transition from passivity to activity. Perhaps we shall be blamed for preferring to keep such gentlemen in prison, but dictatorship is impossible in any other way. We must prepare for dictatorship, and this consists in combating such phrases and such amendments. Throughout, our theses speak of the masses. But, comrades, we need to understand what is meant by masses. The German Communist Workers' Party, the left-wing comrades, misuse this word. But Comrade Terracini, too, and all those who have signed these amendments, do not know how the word masses should be read. I have been speaking too long as it is, hence I wish to say only a few words about the concept of masses. It is one that changes in accordance with the changes in the nature of the struggle. At the beginning of the struggle, it took only a few thousand genuine revolutionary workers to warrant talk of the masses. If the party succeeds in drawing into the struggle not only its own members, if it also succeeds in arousing non-party people, it is well on the way to winning the masses. In our revolutions, there were instances when several thousand workers represented the masses. In the history of our movement and of our struggle against the Mensheviks, you will find many examples where several thousand workers in a town were enough to give a clearly mass character to the movement. You have a mass when several thousand non-party workers, usually of a Philistine life and drag out a miserable existence, and who have never heard anything about politics, begin to act in a revolutionary way. If the movement spreads and intensifies, it gradually develops into a real revolution. We saw this in 1905 and 1917 during 3 revolutions, and you too will have to go through all this. When the revolution has been sufficiently prepared, the concept masses becomes different. Several thousand workers no longer constitute the masses. This word begins to denote something else. The concept of masses undergoes a change so that it implies a majority, and not simply a majority of the workers alone, but the majority of all the exploited. Any other kind of interpretation is impermissible for a revolutionary, and any other sense of the word becomes incomprehensible. It is possible that even a small party, the British or American party, for example, after it has thoroughly studied the course of political development and become acquainted with the life and customs of the non-party masses, will at a favorable moment evoke a revolutionary movement. Comrade Radek has pointed to the miners' strike as a good example. You will have a mass movement if such a party comes forward with its slogans at such a moment and succeeds in getting millions of workers to follow it. I would not altogether deny that a revolution can be started by a very small party and brought to a victorious conclusion. but one must have a knowledge of the methods by which the masses can be won over. For this, the thoroughgoing preparation of revolution is essential. But here you have comrades coming forward with the assertion that we should immediately give up the demand for big masses. They must be challenged. Without thoroughgoing preparation, you will not achieve victory in any country. Quite a small party is sufficient to lead the masses. At certain times, there is no necessity for big organizations. But to win, we must have the sympathy of the masses. An absolute majority is not always essential. But what is essential to win and retain power is not only the majority of the working class, I use the term working class in its West European sense, i.e., in the sense of the industrial proletariat, but also the majority of the working and exploited rural population. Have you thought about this? Do we find in Tarachini's speech even a hint at this thought? He speaks only of dynamic tendency and the transition from passivity to activity. Does he devote even a single word to the food question? And yet the workers demand their vict, although they can put up with a great deal and go hungry, as we have seen to a certain extent in Russia. We must, therefore, win over to our side not only the majority of the working class, but also the majority of the working and exploited rural population. Have you prepared for this? Almost nowhere. And so, I repeat, I must unreservedly defend our theses, and I feel I am bound to do it. We not only condemned the centrists, but expelled them from the party. Now we must deal with another aspect, which we also consider dangerous. We must tell the comrades the truth in the most polite form, and in our theses it is told in a kind and considerate way, so that no one feels insulted. We are confronted now by other, more important questions than that of attacks on the centrists. We have had enough of this question. It has already become somewhat boring. Instead, the comrades ought to learn to wage a real revolutionary struggle. Anyone who is afraid of this is no revolutionary. On the contrary, if we openly declare to the workers, yes, we have made mistakes, it will mean that they will not be repeated and we shall be able better to choose the moment. And if during the struggle itself the majority of the working people prove to be on our side, not only the majority of the workers, but the majority of all the exploited and oppressed, then we shall really be victorious. Prolonged, stormy applause. Teaches at the meeting of members of the German, Polish, Czechoslovakia, Hungarian, and Italian delegations at the Third Congress of the Communist International. Given July 11, 1921. Part 1. I read certain reports yesterday in Pravda which have persuaded me that the moment for an offensive is perhaps nearer than we thought at the Congress and for which the young comrades attacked us. I shall deal with these reports later, however. Just now I want to say that the nearer the general offensive is, the more opportunistically must we act. You will now all return home and tell the workers that we have become more reasonable than we were before the Third Congress. You should not be put out by this. You will say that we made mistakes and now wish to act more carefully. By doing so we shall win the masses over from the Social Democratic and Independent Social Democratic parties, masses who, objectively, by the whole course of events, are being pushed towards us, but who are afraid of us. I want to cite our own example to show you that we must act more carefully. At the beginning of the war, we Bolsheviks adhered to a single slogan, that of civil war, and a ruthless one at that. We branded as a traitor everyone who did not support the idea of civil war. But when we came back to Russia in March 1917, we changed our position entirely. When we returned to Russia and spoke to the peasants and workers, we saw that they all stood for defense of the homeland, of course in quite a different sense from the Mensheviks. And we could not call these ordinary workers and peasants scoundrels and traitors. We described this as honest defensism. I intend to write a big article about this and publish all the material. On April 7, I published my theses, in which I called for caution and patience. Our original stand at the beginning of the war was correct. It was important then to form a definite and resolute corps. Our subsequent stand was correct too. It proceeded from the assumption that the masses had to be won over. At that time we already rejected the idea of the immediate overthrow of the provisional government. I wrote, it should be overthrown, for it is an oligarchat, and not a people's government, and is unable to provide peace or bread. But it cannot be overthrown just now, for it is being kept in power by the workers' Soviets and so far enjoys the confidence of the workers. We are not blankists. We do not want to rule with the minority of the working class against the majority. The cadets, who are shrewd politicians, immediately noticed the contradiction between our former position and the new one, and called us hypocrites. But as, in the same breath, they had called us spies, traitors, scoundrels, and German agents, the former appellation made no impression. The first crisis occurred on April 20. Milkoff's note on the Dardanelles showed the government up for what it was, an imperialist government. After this, the armed masses of the soldiery moved against the building of the government and overthrew Milkoff. They were led by a non-party man named Lind. This movement had not been organized by the party. We characterized that movement at the time as follows: something more than an armed demonstration and something less than an armed uprising. At our conference on April 20, the left trend demanded the immediate overthrow of the government. The Central Committee, on the contrary, declared against the slogan of civil war, and we instructed all agitators in the provinces to deny the outrageous lie about the Bolsheviks wanting civil war. On April 20, I wrote that the slogan, "Down with the provisional government," was incorrect, since if we did not have the majority of the people behind us, this slogan would be either an empty phrase or adventurism. We did not hesitate in face of our enemies to call our leftists event. The Mensheviks crowed over this and talked about our bankruptcy. But we said that any attempt to be slightly, if only we bit, left of the CC was folly, and those who stood left of the CC had lost ordinary common sense. We refused to be intimidated by the fact that our enemies rejoice at our slips. Our sole strategy now is to become stronger, hence clever, more sensible, more opportunistic, and that is what we must tell the masses. But after we shall have won over the masses by our reasonableness, we shall use the tactic of offensive in the strictest sense of that word. Now about the three reports. 1. The strike of Berlin's municipal workers. Municipal workers are mostly conservative people who belong to the Social Democrats of the majority and to the Independent Social Democratic Party. They are well off, but are compelled to strike. The strike of the textile workers in Lee. 3. The third fact is the most important. A meeting was held in Rome to organize the struggle against the fascists, in which 50,000 workers took part, representing all parties, communists, socialists, and also Republicans. 5,000 ex-servicemen came to the meeting in their uniforms, and not a single fascist dared to appear on the street. This shows that there is more inflammable material in Europe than we thought. Lazzari praised their resolution on tactics. It is an important achievement of our Congress. If Lazzari admits it, then the thousands of workers who back him are bound to come to us, and their leaders will not be able to scare them away from us. You have to step back to make a better jump. This jump is inevitable since the situation, objectively, is becoming insufferable. So we are beginning to apply our new tactic. We mustn't get nervy. We cannot be late. Rather, we may start too early. And when you ask whether Russia will be able to hold out so long, we answer that we are now fighting a war with the petty bourgeoisie, with the peasantry, an economic war, which is much more dangerous for us than the last war. But as Clausewitz said, the element of war is a danger, and we have never been out of that danger for a moment. I am sure that if we act more cautiously, if we make concessions in time, we shall win this war too, even if it lasts us over 3 years. Summing up: 1. All of us, unanimously throughout Europe, shall say that we are applying the new tactic, and in this way we shall win the masses. 2. Coordination of the offensive in the most important countries: Germany, Czechoslovakia, Italy. We need here preparation, constant coordination. Europe is pregnant with revolution, but it is impossible to make up a calendar of revolution beforehand. We in Russia will hold out, not only 5 years but more. The only correct strategy is the one we have adopted. I am confident that we shall win positions for the revolution which the Entente will have nothing to put up against, and that will be the beginning of victory on a world scale. Part 2. Smeril seemed to be pleased with my speech, but he interprets it one-sidedly. I said in the committee that in order to find the correct line, Smeril had to make 3 steps to the left, and Krybich 1 step to the right. Smeril, unfortunately, said nothing about taking these steps. Nor did he say anything about his views on the situation. Concerning the difficulties, Smeril merely repeated the old arguments and said nothing new. Smeril said that I had dispelled his fears. In the spring he was afraid that the communist leadership would demand of him untimely action, but events dispelled these fears. But what worries us now is this: will things really come to the stage of preparation for the offensive in Czechoslovakia, or will they be confined merely to talk about difficulties? The left mistake is simply a mistake. It isn't big and is easily rectified. But if the mistake pertains to resolution to act, then this is by no means a small mistake, it is a betrayal. These mistakes do not bear comparison. The theory that we shall make a revolution, but only after others have acted first, is utterly fallacious. Part 3. The retreat made at this Congress can, I think, be compared with our actions in 1917 in Russia, and therefore prove that this retreat must serve as preparation for the offensive. Our opponents will say that we are not saying today what we said before. It will do them little good, but the working class masses will understand us if we tell them in what sense the March action is to be considered a success and why we criticize its mistakes and say that we should make better preparations in future. I agree with Tarachini when he says that the interpretations of Smeril and Burian are wrong. If coordination is to be understood as our having to wait until another country has started, a country that is richer and has a bigger population, then this is not a communist interpretation, but downright deception. Coordination should consist in comrades from other countries knowing exactly what moments are significant. The really important interpretation of coordination is this: the best and quickest imitation of a good example. That of the workers of Rome is a good example. A letter to the German communists, written August 14, 1921. Dear comrades, I had intended to state my view of the lessons of the Third Congress of the Communist International in a detailed article. Unfortunately, I have not yet been able to start on this work because of ill health. The fact that a Congress of your party, the United Communist Party of Germany, VKPD, has been called for August 22, compels me to hasten with this letter, which I have to finish within a few hours, if I am not to be late in sending it to Germany. So far as I can judge, the position of the Communist Party in Germany is a particularly difficult one. This is understandable. Firstly and mainly, from the end of 1918, the international position of Germany very quickly and sharply aggravated her internal revolutionary crisis and impelled the vanguard of the proletariat towards an immediate seizure of power. At the same time, the German and the entire international bourgeoisie, excellently armed and organized, and taught by the Russian experience, hurled itself upon the revolutionary proletariat of Germany in a frenzy of hate. Tens of thousands of the best people of Germany, her revolutionary workers, were killed or tortured to death by the bourgeoisie, its heroes, Nossi and Company, its servants, the Schiedemanns, etc., and by its indirect and subtle, and therefore particularly valuable, accomplices, the Knights of the 2.5 International, with their despicable spinelessness, vacillations, pedantry, and philistinism. The armed capitalists set traps for the unarmed workers, they killed them wholesale, murdered their leaders, ambushing them one by one, and making excellent use to this end of the counter-revolutionary howling of both shades of social democrats, the Scheidenites and the Kautzites. When the crisis broke out, however, the German workers lacked a genuine revolutionary party, owing to the fact that the split was brought about too late, and owing to the burden of the Akros tradition of unity with capital's corrupt, the Schiedemanns, Davids and Company, and spineless, the Kautzis, Hilferdings and Companies, and of lackeys. The heart of every honest and class-conscious worker who accepted the Basel Manifesto of 1912 at its face value and not as a gesture on the part of the scoundrels of a second, and the 2.5 raids was filled with incredibly bitter hatred for the opportunism of the old German Social Democrats. And this hatred, the greatest and most noble sentiment of the best people among the oppressed and exploited masses, blinded people and prevented them from keeping their heads and working out a correct strategy with which to reply to the excellent strategy of the Entente capitalists who were armed, organized, and schooled by the Russian experience, and supported by France, Britain, and America. This hatred pushed them into premature insurrections. That is why the development of the revolutionary working class movement in Germany has since the end of 1918 been treading a particularly hard and painful road. But it is marching and is marching steadily forward. There is the incontrovertible fact of the gradual swing to the left among the masses of workers, the real majority of the land-exploited people in Germany, both those organized and the old, Menshevik trade unions, i.e., the unions serving the bourgeoisie, and those entirely, or almost entirely, unorganized. What the German proletariat must and will do, and this is the guarantee of victory, is keep their heads, systematically rectify the mistakes of the past, steadily win over the mass of the workers both inside and outside the trade unions, patiently build up a strong and intelligent communist party capable of giving real leadership to the masses at every turn of events, and work out a strategy that is on a level with the best international strategy of the most advanced bourgeoisie, which is enlightened by its long experience in general, and the Russian experience in particular. On the other hand, the difficult position of the Communist Party of Germany is aggravated at the present moment by the breakaway of the not very good communists on the left, the Communist Workers' Party of Germany, KPD, and on the right beginning with the Second Congress of the Communist International. The leftists, or KPists, have received sufficient warning from us in the international arena. Until sufficiently strong, experienced, and influential communist parties have been built, at least in the principal countries, the participation of semi-anarchist elements in our international congresses has to be tolerated, and is to some extent even useful. It is useful insofar as these elements serve as a clear warning to inexperienced communists, and also insofar as they themselves are still capable of warning. All over the world, anarchism has been splitting up, not since yesterday, but since the beginning of the imperialist war of 1914-18 into two trends, one pro-Soviet and the other anti-Soviet, one in favor of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the other against it. We must allow this process of disintegration among the anarchists to go on and come to a head. Hardly anyone in Western Europe has experienced anything like a big revolution. There, the experience of great revolutions has been almost entirely forgotten, and the transition from the desire to be revolutionary and from talk and resolutions about revolution to real revolutionary work is very difficult, painful, and slow. It goes without saying, however, that the semi-anarchist elements can and should be tolerated only within certain limits. In Germany, we tolerated them for quite a long time. The Third Congress of the Communist International faced them with an ultimatum and fixed a definite time limit. If they have now voluntarily resigned from the Communist International, all the better. Firstly, they have saved us the trouble of expelling them. Secondly, it has now been demonstrated most conclusively and most graphically, and proved with precise facts to all vacillating workers, and all those who have been inclined towards anarchism because of their hatred for the opportunism of the old social democrats, that the Communist International has been patient, that it has not expelled anarchists immediately and unconditionally, and that it has given them an attentive hearing and helped them to learn. We must now pay less attention to the KAPists. By polemicing with them, we merely give them publicity. They are unintelligent. It is wrong to take them seriously, and it is not worth being angry with them. They have no influence among the masses, and will acquire none, unless we make mistakes. Let us leave this tiny trend to die a natural death. The workers themselves will realize that it is worthless. Let us propagate and implement, with greater effect, the organizational and tactical decisions of the Third Congress of the Communist International, instead of giving the KAP publicity by arguing with them. The infantile disorder of leftism is passing and will pass away as the movement grows. Similarly, we are now needlessly helping Paul Levi. We are needlessly giving him publicity by polemicking with him. That we should argue with him is exactly what he wants. Now, after the decisions of the Third Congress of the Communist International, we must forget about him and devote all our attention, all our efforts, to peaceful, practical, and constructive work without any squabbling, polemics, or bringing up of the quarrels of yesterday. In the spirit of the decisions of the Third Congress, it is my conviction that Comrade K. Radek's article, The Third World Congress on the March Action and Future Tactics, sins quite considerably against this general and unanimously adopted decision of the Third Congress. This article, a copy of which was sent me by one of the Polish communists, is quite unnecessarily, and in a way that positively harms our work, directed not only against Paul Levi, that would be very unimportant, but also against Claire Zetkin. And yet Claire Zetkin herself concluded a peace treaty in Moscow during the Third Congress with the CC, the Central, of the United Communist Party of Germany, providing for joint, non-factional work, and we all approved of the treaty. In his misplaced polemical zeal, Comrade K. Radek has gone to the length of saying something positively untrue, attributing to Zetkin the idea of putting off every general action by the party until the day when large masses rise. There is nothing Paul Levi wants so much as a controversy endlessly dragged out, with as many people involved in it as possible, and efforts to drive Zetkin away from the party by polemical breaches of the peace treaty, which she herself concluded, and which was approved by the entire Communist International. Comrade K. Radek's article serves as an excellent example of how Paul Levi is assisted from the left. Here I must explain to the German comrades why I defended Paul Levi so long at the Third Congress. Firstly, because I made Levi's acquaintance Radek in Switzerland in 1915 or 1916. At that time Levi was already a Bolshevik. I cannot help entertaining a certain amount of distrust towards those who accepted Bolshevism only after its victory in Russia, and after it had scored a number of victories in the international arena. But, of course, this reason is relatively unimportant, for, after all, my personal knowledge of Paul Levi is very small. Incomparably more important was the second reason, namely, that essentially much of Levi's criticism of the March action in Germany in 1921 was correct, not, of course, when he said that the uprising was a putsch. That assertion of his was absurd. It is true that Levi did all he possibly could, and much besides, to weaken and spoil his criticism, and make it difficult for himself and others to understand the essence of the matter, by bringing in a mass of details in which he was obviously wrong. Levi couched his criticism in an impermissible and harmful form. While urging others to pursue a cautious and well-considered strategy, Levi himself committed worse blunders than a schoolboy, by rushing into battle so prematurely, so unprepared, so absurdly and wildly that he was certain to lose any battle, spoiling or hampering his work for many years, although the battle could and should have been won. Levi behaved like an anarchist intellectual, instead of behaving like an organized member of the Proletarian Communist International. Levi committed a breach of discipline. By this series of incredibly stupid blunders, Levi made it difficult to concentrate attention on the essence of the matter. And the essence of the matter, i.e., the appraisal and correction of the innumerable mistakes made by the United Communist Party of Germany during the March action of 1921, has been and continues to be of enormous importance. In order to explain and correct these mistakes, which some people enshrined as gems of Marxist tactics, it was necessary to have been on the right wing during the Third Congress of the Communist International. Otherwise, the line of the Communist International would have been a wrong one. I defended and had to defend Levi, insofar as I saw before me opponents of his who merely shouted about Menshevikism and centrism and refused to see the mistakes of the March action and the need to explain and correct them. These people made a caricature of revolutionary Marxism, and a pastime of the struggle against centrism. They might have done the greatest harm to the whole cause, for no one in the world can compromise the revolutionary Marxists if they do not compromise themselves. I said to these people, granted that Levi has become a Menshevik. As I have scant knowledge of him personally, I will not insist, if the point is proved to me. But it has not yet been proved. All that has been proved till now is that he has lost his head. It is childishly stupid to declare a man a Menshevik merely on these grounds. The training of experienced and influential party leaders is a long and difficult job, and without it the dictatorship of the proletariat and its unity of will remain a phrase. In Russia, it took us 15 years, 1903-17, to produce a group of leaders, 15 years of fighting Menshevikism, 15 years of Tsarist persecution, 15 years, which included the years of the First Revolution, 1905, a great and mighty revolution. Yet we have had our sad cases when even fine comrades have lost their heads. If the West European comrades imagine that they are insured against such sad cases, it is sheer childishness, and we cannot but combat it. Levi had to be expelled for breach of discipline. Tactics had to be determined on the basis of a most detailed explanation and correction of the mistakes made during the March 1921 action. If, after this, Levi wants to behave in the old way, he will show that his expulsion was justified, and the wavering or hesitant workers will be given all the more forceful and convincing proof of the absolute correctness of the Third Congress decisions concerning Paul Levi. Having made a cautious approach at the Congress to the appraisal of Levi's mistakes, I can now say with all the more assurance that Levi has hastened to confirm the worst expectations. I have before me number 6 of his magazine. It is evident from the editorial note printed at the head of the magazine that the decisions of the Third Congress are known to Paul Levi. What is his reply to them? Menshevik catchwords such as a great excommunication, canon law, and that he will quite freely discuss these decisions. What greater freedom can a man have if he has been freed of the title of party member and member of the Communist International? And please note that he expects party members to write for him, for Levi, anonymously. First, he plays a dirty trick on the party, he hits it in the back, and sabotages its work. Then, he discusses the essence of the Congress decisions. That is magnificent. But by doing this, Levi puts paid to himself. Paul Levi wants to continue the fight. It will be a great strategic error to satisfy his desire. I would advise the German comrades to prohibit all controversy with Levi and his magazine in the columns of the daily party press. He must not be given publicity. He must not be allowed to divert the fighting party's attention from important matters to unimportant ones. In cases of extreme necessity, the controversy could be conducted in weekly or monthly magazines or in pamphlets, and as far as possible care must be taken not to afford the KPist and Paul Levi the pleasure they feel when they are mentioned by name. Reference should simply be made to certain not very clever critics who at all costs want to regard themselves as communists. I am informed that at the last meeting of the enlarged CC, even the left-winger Friesland was compelled to launch a sharp attack on Mossel, who is playing at leftism and wishes to exercise himself in centrist. The unreasonableness, to put it mildly, of this Mossel's conduct was also revealed over here in Moscow. Leas Mossel and 2 or 3 of his supporters and confederates, who obviously do not wish to observe the peace treaty and have more zeal than sense, should be sent by the German party to Soviet Russia for a year or 2. We would find useful work for them. We would make men of them, and the international German movement would certainly gain thereby. The German communists must at all cost end the internal dissension, get rid of the quarrelsome elements on both sides, forget about Paul Levi and the KAPs and get down to real work. There is plenty to be done. In my opinion, the tactical and organizational resolutions of the Third Congress of the Communist International mark a great step forward. Every effort must be exerted to really put both resolutions into effect. This is a difficult matter, but it can and should be done. First, the Communists had to proclaim their principles to the world. That was done at the First Congress. It was the first step. The second step was to give the Communist International organizational form and to draw up conditions for affiliation to it, conditions making for real separation from the centrist, from the direct and indirect agents of the bourgeoisie within the working class movement. That was done at the Second Congress. At the Third Congress, it was necessary to start practical, constructive work to determine concretely, taking account of the practical experience of the communist struggle already begun, exactly what the line of further activity should be in respect of tactics and of organization. We have taken this third step. We have an army of communists all over the world. It is still poorly trained and poorly organized. It would be extremely harmful to forget this truth or be afraid of admitting it. Admitting ourselves to a most careful and rigorous test, and studying the experience of our own movement, we must train this army efficiently, we must organize it properly, and test it in all sorts of maneuvers, all sorts of battles, in attack and in retreat. We cannot win without this long and hard schooling. The crux of the situation in the international communist movement in the summer of 1921 was that some of the best and most influential sections of the Communist International did not quite properly understand this tax. They exaggerated the struggle against centrism ever so slightly. They went ever so slightly beyond the borderline at which the struggle turns into a pastime and revolutionary Marxism begins to be compromised. That was the crux of the Third Congress. The exaggeration was a slight one, but the danger arising out of it was enormous. It was difficult to combat it, because the exaggerating was done by really the best and most loyal elements, without whom the formation of the Communist International would, perhaps, have been impossible. In the tactical amendments published in the newspaper Moscow in German, French and English and signed by the German, Austrian and Italian delegations, this exaggeration was definitely revealed, the more so because these amendments were proposed to a draft resolution that was already final, following long and all-round preparatory work. The rejection of these amendments was a straightening out of the line of the Communist International. It was a victory over the danger of exaggeration. Exaggeration, if not corrected, was sure to kill the Communist International. For no one in the world can compromise the revolutionary Marxists if they do not compromise themselves. No one in the world will be able to prevent the victory of the communists over the Second and the 2.5 internationals, and under the conditions prevailing in 20th century Western Europe and America, after the First Imperialist War, this means victory over the bourgeoisie, unless the communists prevent it themselves. Exaggeration, however slight, means preventing victory. Exaggeration of the struggle against centrism means saving centrism, means strengthening its position, its influence over the workers. In the period between the Second and the Third Congresses, we learned to wage a victorious struggle against centrism on an international scale. This is proved by the facts. We will continue to wage the struggle, expulsion of Levi and of Sardi's party, to the end. We have, however, not yet learned, on an international scale, to combat wrong exaggerations in the struggle against centrism. But we have become conscious of this defect, as has been proved by the course and outcome of the Third Congress. And precisely because we have become conscious of our defect, we will rid ourselves of it, and then we shall be invincible, because without support inside the proletariat, through the medium of the bourgeois agents of the Second and the 2.5 internationals, the bourgeoisie in Western Europe and America cannot retain power. More careful, more thorough preparation for fresh and more decisive battles, both offensive and offensive, that is a fundamental and principal thing in the decisions of the Third Congress. Quote, Communism will become a mass force in Italy if the Italian Communist Party unceasingly and steadily fights the opportunist policy of sadism and at the same time is able to maintain close contact with the proletarian masses and the trade unions, during strikes, during clashes with the counter-revolutionary fascist organizations, if it is able to merge the movements of all the working class organizations and to transform the spontaneous outbreaks of the working class into carefully prepared battles." Unquote. End quote. The United Communist Party of Germany will be the better able to carry out mass action, the better it adapts its fighting slogans to the actual situation and future, the more thoroughly it studies the situation, and the more coordinated and disciplined the action it conducts." Unquote. Such are the most pertinent passages of the tactical resolution of the Third Congress. To win over the majority of the proletariat to our side, such is the principal attack, the heading of point 3 of the resolution on tactics. Of course, we do not give the winning of the majority a formal interpretation, as do the Knights of Philistine Democracy of the 2.5 International. When in Rome, in July 1921, the entire proletariat, the reformist proletariat of the trade unions and the centrist Societies Party, followed the communists against the fascists. That was winning over the majority of the working class to our side. This was far, very far, from winning them decisively. It was doing so only partially, only momentarily, only locally. But it was winning over the majority, and that is possible even if, formally, the majority of the proletariat follow bourgeois leaders, or leaders who pursue a bourgeois policy, as do all the leaders of the Second and the 2.5 Internationals, or if the majority of the proletariat are wavering. This winning over is gaining ground steadily in every way throughout the world. Let us make more thorough and careful preparations for it. Let us not allow a single serious opportunity to slip by when the bourgeoisie compels the proletariat to undertake a struggle. Let us learn to correctly determine the moment when the masses of the proletariat cannot but rise together with us. Then victory will be assured, no matter how severe some of the defeats and transitions in our great campaign may be. Our tactical and strategic methods, if we take them on an international scale, still lag behind the excellent strategy of the bourgeoisie, which has learned from the example of Russia and will not let itself be taken by surprise. But our forces are greater, immeasurably greater. We are learning tactics and strategy. We have advanced this science on the basis of the mistakes of the March 1921 action. We shall completely master this science. In the overwhelming majority of countries, our parties are still very far from being what real communist parties should be. They are far from being real vanguards of the genuinely revolutionary and only revolutionary class, with every single member taking part in the struggle, in the movement, and in the everyday life of the masses. But we are aware of this defect. We brought it out most strikingly in the Third Congress resolution on the work of the party, and we shall overcome this defect. Comrades, German Communists, permit me to conclude by expressing the wish that your party Congress on August 20 will with a firm hand put a stop once and for all to the trivial struggle against those who have broken away on the left and the right. Inter-party struggles must stop. Down with everyone who wants to drag them out, directly or indirectly. We know our tasks today much more clearly, concretely and thoroughly than we did yesterday. We are not afraid of pointing openly to our mistakes in order to rectify them. We shall now devote all the party's efforts to improving its organization, to enriching the quality and content of its work, to creating closer contact with the masses, and to working out increasingly correct and accurate working class tactics and strategy. With communist greetings, Lenin. A letter to Polish communists, written October 19, 1921. Dear comrades, judging by the scrappy information concerning the growth of the communist movement in Poland that reaches our newspapers, and judging, still more, by the reports of some very prominent Polish comrades, the revolution in Poland is coming to a head. A workers' revolution is brewing, the complete collapse of the Polish Socialist Party, and Russian SH and Mensheviks. The trade unions, one after another, are joining the communists, the growth of demonstrations, and so on. Imminent and inevitable financial collapse. The gigantic failure of bourgeois democracy and of the petty bourgeoisie in Poland with the agrarian reform, a failure that is foredoomed, inevitable, and bound to push the majority of the rural population, the whole poor section of the peasantry, towards the communists. Financial collapse and shameless plunder of Poland by Entente capital, France, and other countries are bringing with them a practical exposure of national and great power illusions, an exposure that is strikingly clear and tangible to the masses, to the rank-and-file work, to the rank-and-file peasant. If this is so, then the revolution, Soviet revolution, in Poland is bound to win, and win soon. That being the case, the government and the bourgeoisie must be prevented from strangling the revolution by bloody suppression of a premature uprising. You must not be provoked. You must wait for the tide to rise to its highest. It will sweep everything away and give victory to the communists. If the bourgeoisie kills 100-300 people, this will not ruin the cause. But if it is able to provoke a massacre to kill 10-30,000 workers, this may delay the revolution even for several years. If it is important for the government to hold elections to the Sejm, then an effort should be made for the Sejm to be won by the wave of the workers' revolution and the peasants' discontent. Do not yield to provocation. The revolution must be allowed to grow to full ripening of the fruit. The victory of Soviet power from within Poland will be a gigantic international victory. If Soviet power has, in my opinion, now won an international victory to the extent of 20-30%, then with the victory of Soviet power from within Poland, we shall have a 40-50, perhaps even 51% international victory of the Communist Revolution. For Poland is next door to Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, and a Soviet Poland will undermine the whole regime built up on the Peace of Versailles. That is why the Polish communists bear a responsibility before the whole world that of keeping a firm grip on the helm of their ship and steering clear of provocations. Is it worthwhile retaliating for the beating up of Delegations by Delegations and Company? Retaliation, if any, should be by beating up Delegations, just like that, without any shooting or wounding. It may be worthwhile if it has the effect of teaching an insolent fellow a lesson at the hands of the workers, and stiffening the workers' spirit at the cost of a sacrifice of 5-10 of them, by imprisonment or execution. But maybe it is not worthwhile. Would not the fact that our Delegations had been brutally beaten up be more useful for the purpose of agitation among the peasants? Would it not be more effective in turning the sympathy of the backward peasants towards us than the thrashing of Delegations? This should be weighed more carefully. With communist greetings, Lenin. The importance of gold now and after the complete victory of socialism. November 5, 1921. The best way to celebrate the anniversary of a great revolution is to concentrate attention on its unsolved problems. It is particularly appropriate and necessary to celebrate the revolution in this way at a time when we are faced with fundamental problems that the revolution has not yet solved, and when we must master something new, from the point of view of what the revolution has accomplished up to now, for the solution of these problems. What is new for a revolution at the present time is the need for a reformist, gradual, cautious, and roundabout approach to the solution of the fundamental problems of economic development. This novelty gives rise to a number of questions, perplexities, and doubts in both theory and practice. The theoretical question, how can we explain the transition from a series of extremely revolutionary actions to extremely reformist actions in the same field at a time when the revolution as a whole is making victorious progress? Does it not imply a surrender of positions and admission of defeat, or something of that sort? Of course, our enemies, from the semi-feudal type of reactionaries to the Mensheviks or other knights of the 2.5 International, say that it does. They would not be enemies if they did not shout something of the sort on every pretext, and even without any pretext. The touching unanimity that prevails on this question among all parties, from the feudal reactionaries to the Mensheviks, is only further proof that all these parties constitute one reactionary mass, opposed to the proletarian revolution, as Engels foresaw in his letters to Bebel of 1875 and 1884, be it said in parenthesis. But there is perplexity, shall we say, among friends, too. Restore large-scale industry, organize the direct exchange of its goods for the produce of small peasant farming, and thus assist the socialization of the latter. For the purpose of restoring large-scale industry, borrow from the peasants a certain quantity of foodstuffs and raw materials by requisitioning. This was the plan, or method, system, that we followed for more than 3 years, up to the spring of 1921. This was a revolutionary approach to the problem, to break up the old social-economic system completely at one stroke and to substitute a new one for it. Since the spring of 1921, instead of this approach, plan, method, or mode of action we have been adopting, we have not yet adopted, but are still adopting, and have not yet fully realized it, a totally different method, a reformist type of method, not to break up the old social economic system, trade, petty production, petty proprietorship, capitalism, but to revive trade, petty proprietorship, capitalism, while cautiously and gradually getting the upper hand over them, or making it possible to subject them to state regulation only to the extent that they revive. That is an entirely different approach to the problem. Compared with the previous revolutionary approach, it is a reformist approach. Revolution is a change which breaks the old order to its very foundations, and not one that cautiously, slowly and gradually remodels it, taking care to break as little as possible. The question that arises is this: if, after trying revolutionary methods, you find they have failed and adopt reformist methods, does it not prove that you are declaring the revolution to have been a mistake in general? Does it not prove that you should not have started with the revolution but should have started with reforms and confined yourselves to them? That is the conclusion which the Mensheviks and others like them have drawn. But this conclusion is either sophistry, a mere fraud perpetrated by case-hardened politicians, or it is the childishness of political ties. The greatest, perhaps the only danger to the genuine revolutionary is that of exaggerated revolutionism, ignoring the limits and conditions in which revolutionary methods are appropriate and can be successfully employed. True revolutionaries have mostly come a cropper when they began to write revolution with a capital R, to elevate revolution to something almost divine, to lose their heads, to lose the ability to reflect, weigh and ascertain in the coolest and most dispassionate manner at what moment, under what circumstances, and in which sphere of action you must act in a revolutionary manner, and at what moment, under what circumstances, and in which sphere you must turn to reformist action. True revolutionaries will perish, not that they will be defeated from outside, but that their work will suffer internal collapse, only if they abandon their sober outlook and take it into their heads that the great, victorious world revolution can and must solve all problems in a revolutionary manner under all circumstances and in all spheres of action. If they do this, their doom is certain. He who gets such ideas into his head is lost because he has foolish ideas about a fundamental problem. And in a fierce war, and revolution is the fiercest sort of war, the penalty for folly is defeat. What grounds are there for assuming that the great, victorious world revolution can and must employ only revolutionary methods? There are none at all. The assumption is a pure fallacy. This can be proved by purely theoretical propositions if we stick to Marxism. The experience of our revolution also shows that it is a fallacy. From the theoretical point of view, foolish things are done in time of revolution just as at any other time, said Engels, and he was right. We must try to do as few foolish things as possible, and rectify those that are done as quickly as possible, and we must, as soberly as we can, estimate which problems can be solved by revolutionary methods at any given time and which cannot. From the point of view of our practical experience, the Brest Peace was an example of action that was not revolutionary at all. It was reformist, and even worse, because it was a retreat, whereas, as a general rule, reformist action advances slowly, cautiously, gradually, and does not move backward. The proof that our tactics in concluding the Brest Peace were correct is now so complete, so obvious to all and generally admitted, that there is no need to say any more about it. Our revolution has completed only its bourgeois democratic work, and we have every right to be proud of this. The proletarian or socialist part of its work may be summed up in three main points. 1. The revolutionary withdrawal from the imperialist world war. The exposure and halting of the slaughter organized by the two world groups of capitalist predators. For our part, we have done this in full. Others could have done it only if there had been a revolution in a number of advanced countries. 2. The establishment of the Soviet system, as a form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. An epoch-making change has been made. The era of bourgeois democratic parliamentarism has come to an end. A new chapter in world history, the era of proletarian dictatorship, has been opened. The Soviet system in all forms of proletarian dictatorship will have the finishing touches put to them and be completed only by the efforts of a number of countries. There is still a great deal we have not done in this field. It would be unpardonable to lose sight of this. Again and again we shall have to improve the work, redo it, start from the beginning. Every step onward and upward that we take in developing our productive forces and our culture must be accompanied by the work of improving and altering our Soviet system. We are still low in the scale of economics and culture. Much will have to be altered, and to be embarrassed by this would be absurd, if not worse. 3. The creation of the economic basis of the socialist system, the main features of what is most important, most fundamental, have not yet been completed. This, however, is our soundest basis, soundest from the point of view of principle and from the practical point of view, from the point of view of the SFSR today and from the international point of view. Since the main features of this basis have not yet been completed, we must concentrate all our attention upon it. The difficulty here lies in the form of the transition. In April 1918, in my immediate task of the Soviet government, I wrote, "It is not enough to be a revolutionary and an adherent of socialism or a communist in general. You must be able at each particular moment to find the particular link in the chain which you must grasp with all your might in order to hold the whole chain and to prepare firmly for the transition to the next link. The order of the links, their form, the manner in which they are linked together, their difference from each other in the historical chain of events are not as simple and not as senseless as those in an ordinary chain made by a smith. At the present time, in the sphere of activity with which we are dealing, this link is the revival of home trade under proper state regulation, direction. Trade is the link in the historical chain of events, in the transitional forms of our socialist construction in 1921-22, which we, the proletarian government, we, the ruling Communist Party, must grasp with all our might. If we grasp this link firmly enough now, we shall certainly control the whole chain in the very near future. If we do not, we shall not control the whole chain, we shall not create the foundation for social and economic relations. Communism in trade. It sounds strange. The two seem to be unconnected, and Congress pulls apart. But if we study it from the point of view of economics, we shall find that the one is no more remote from the other than communism is from small peasant, patriarchal farming. When we are victorious on a world scale, I think we shall use gold for the purpose of building public lavatories in the streets of some of the largest cities of the world. This would be the most just and most educational way of utilizing gold for the benefit of these generations which had not forgotten how. For the sake of gold, 10 million men were killed and 30 million maimed in the Great War for Freedom, the War of 1914-18, the war that was waged to decide the great question of which peace was the worst, that of Brest or that of Versailles, and how, for the sake of this same gold, they certainly intend to kill 20 million men and to maim 60 million in a war, say 1925 or 1928, between, say, Japan and the USA, or between Britain and the USA, or something like that. But however just, useful, or humane it would be to utilize gold for this purpose, we nevertheless say that we must work for another decade or two with the same intensity and with the same success as in the 1917-21 period, only in a much wider field, in order to reach this state. Meanwhile, we must save the gold in the USSR, sell it at the highest price, buy goods with it at the lowest price. When you live among wolves, you must howl like a wolf, while as for exterminating all the wolves, as should be done in a rational human society, we shall act up to the wise Russian proverb, boast not before but after the battle. Trade is the only possible economic link between the scores of millions of small farmers and large-scale industry if there is not alongside these farmers an excellently equipped large-scale machine industry with a network of power transmission lines, an industry whose technical equipment, organizational superstructures, and other features are sufficient to enable it to supply the small farmers with the best goods in larger quantities, more quickly and more cheaply than before. On a world scale, this, if, has already been achieved, this condition already exists. But the country, formerly one of the most backward capitalist countries, which tried alone directly and at one stroke to create, to put into use, to organize practically the new links between industry and agriculture, failed to achieve this task by direct assault, and must now try to achieve it by a number of slow, gradual, and cautious siege operations. The proletarian government can control trade, direct it into definite channels, keep it within certain limits. I shall give a very small example. In the Don Basin, a slight, still very slight, but undoubted revival in the economy has commenced, partly due to a rise in the productivity of labor at the large state mines, and partly due to the leasing of small mines to peasants. As a result, the proletarian government is receiving a small additional quantity, a miserably small quantity compared with what is obtained in the advanced countries, but an appreciable quantity considering our poverty-stricken condition, of coal at a cost of 100. And it is selling this coal to various government departments at a price of, say, 120, and to private individuals at a price of, say, 140. I must say in parenthesis that my figures are quite arbitrary, first because I do not know the exact figures, and, secondly, I would not now make them public even if I did. This looks as if we are beginning, if only in very modest dimensions, to control exchange between industry and agriculture, to control wholesale trade, to cope with the task of taking in hand the available, small, backward industry, or large-scale but weakened and ruined industry, of reviving trade on the present economic basis, of making the ordinary middle peasant, and that is the typical peasant, the peasant in the mass, the true representative of the petty bourgeois milieu, feel the benefit of the economic revival, of taking advantage of it for the purpose of more systematically and persistently, more widely and successfully restoring large-scale industry. We shall not surrender to sentimental socialism or to the old Russian, semi-aristocratic, semi-magic and patriarchal mood, with their supreme contempt for trade. We can use, and since it is necessary, we must learn to use, all transitional economic forms for the purpose of strengthening the link between the peasantry and the proletariat, for the purpose of immediately reviving the economy of our ruined and tormented country, of improving industry, and facilitating such future, more extensive and more deep-going, measures of electrification. Marxism alone has precisely and correctly defined the relation of reforms to revolution, although Marx was able to see this relation only from one aspect. Under the conditions preceding the first to any extent permanent and lasting victory of the proletariat, if only in one country. Under those conditions, the basis of the proper relation was that reforms are a byproduct of the revolutionary class struggle of the proletariat. Throughout the capitalist world, this relation is the foundation of the revolutionary tactics of the proletariat. The UBC, which is being distorted and obscured by the corrupt leaders of the Second International, and the half-pedantic and half-finicky knights of the Two and a Half International. After the victory of the proletariat, if only in one country, something new enters into the relation between reforms and revolution. In principle, it is the same as before, but a change in form takes place, which Marx himself could not foresee, but which can be appreciated only on the basis of the philosophy and politics of Marxism. Why were we able to carry out the Brest retreat successfully? Because we had advanced so far that we had room in which to retreat. At such dizzy speed, in a few weeks, from October 25, 1917, to the Brest Peace, we built up the Soviet state, withdrew from the imperialist war in a revolutionary manner and completed the bourgeois democratic revolution so that even the great backward movement, the Brest Peace, left us sufficient room in which to take advantage of the respite, and to march forward victoriously against Kolchak, Denikin, Yunich, Pilsudski, and Wrangel. And for the victory of the proletariat, reforms are a byproduct of the revolutionary class struggle. After the victory, while still remaining a byproduct on an international scale, they are, in addition, for the country in which victory has been achieved, a necessary and legitimate breathing space when, after the utmost exertion of effort, it becomes obvious that sufficient strength is lacking for the revolutionary accomplishment of some transition or another. Victory creates such a reserve of strength that it is possible to hold out even in a forced retreat, hold out both materially and morally. Holding out materially means preserving a sufficient superiority of forces to prevent the enemy from inflicting utter defeat. Holding out morally means not allowing oneself to become demoralized and disorganized, keeping a sober view of the situation, preserving vigor and firmness of spirit, even retreating a long way, but not too far, and in such a way as to stop the retreat in time and revert to the offensive. We retreated to state capitalism, but we did not retreat too far. We are now retreating to the state regulation of trade, but we shall not retreat too far. There are visible signs that the retreat is coming to an end. There are signs that we shall be able to stop this retreat in the not-too-distant future. The more conscious, the more unanimous, the more free from prejudice we are in carrying out this necessary retreat, the sooner shall we be able to stop it, and the more lasting, speedy, and extensive will be our subsequent victorious advance.